Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where curiosity gets comfortable and science softens its edges for the evening. Tonight, we're slipping far past the age of ships and whales, past the first dinosaurs, past forests as we know them, and into an older sea ruled by a fish that looked less like something nature slowly assembled and more like something a blacksmith and a nightmare designed together after a very long day. Our gentle subject for tonight is Dunkleosteus, the prehistoric armoured hunter, often remembered as the fish that could crush almost anything unlucky enough to drift into its path. And before we ease into those ancient waters, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what sort of hour has found you. There is something fitting about that, I think. A creature from nearly 400 million years ago, arriving quietly in the middle of someone's ordinary evening. If this sleepy little expedition brings you some calm, some interest, or simply a softer landing at the end of a long day, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this quiet corner travel a little farther. Now, do get settled, let your shoulders unclench, and let's go meet a fish that wore its face like a helmet and its mouth like a set of shears. It is easy, from the comfort of a modern sofa and a reasonably well-behaved lamp, to imagine ancient life as a steady march toward familiar things. A few primitive creatures here, a few awkward experiments there, and eventually the world learns how to become normal. But the real history of life was never so tidy. It was full of sudden inventions, strange body plans, and animals that make perfect sense only after you stop expecting them to resemble anything alive today. Dunkleosteus belongs to that category. It was not a dinosaur. It was not a marine reptile. It was not a shark, though it is often introduced that way by people who mean well and have perhaps been bullied by the shape of a dorsal fin into saying inaccurate things. It was an arthrodire, one of the armoured jawed fishes that flourished during the Devonian, a span so rich in fish diversity that it is still called the Age of Fishes. In those seas, jaws were no longer a novelty. They were an opportunity, and some lineages use that opportunity with astonishing enthusiasm. The first thing most people notice about Dunkleosteus is the head, and that is sensible because the head seems to have arrived with very strong opinions. The front of the animal was wrapped in thick dermal armour, plates of bone locking together into a heavy shield over the skull and upper trunk. It did not look sleek in the neat silver way of a tuna, or sinister in the cold, efficient way of a shark. It looked fortified. It looked defended before it looked fast. It looked as though the sea itself had decided to manufacture a battering ram, and then, for added flair, given the battering ram a mouth. This is one of the reasons the animal stays in the imagination so easily. Even as a fossil, even reduced to stone and museum light, it gives the impression of force held in reserve. The armour is not decorative, it is a statement. Whatever this thing was doing in the water, it was not sneaking politely through the food web hoping not to be noticed. Then there is the matter of the jaws, which are even stranger than the helmet. Dunkleosteus did not have true teeth in the ordinary sense. No rows of replaceable enamel daggers, no neat crocodilian display. Instead, it had sharpened bony jaw plates, hard cutting edges built from the jaws themselves. Museum descriptions and modern research alike emphasize that these blade-like edges effectively functioned as self-sharpening tools, wearing against one another as the mouth opened and closed. It is difficult not to admire the economy of that design. Most predators are given teeth and then must manage them. Dunkleosteus seems to have skipped the whole arrangement and gone straight to becoming its own set of kitchen shears. The upper skull could also participate in the movement in a way that feels almost unfair, helping the mouth open wide, with some museum descriptions noting a gape that could reach around 45 degrees. This was not the sort of face one wanted appearing from dim water with purpose in its movements. What makes those jaws especially impressive is that they were not merely strong, they were quick. Biomechanical studies suggest that Dunkleosteus could open its mouth in roughly 20 milliseconds and complete a feeding strike in about 50 to 60 milliseconds, fast enough to generate suction as the jaws snapped apart and then came together. That combination matters. A bite can be powerful and still clumsy. A strike can be quick and still underwhelming. Dunkleosteus appears to have paired speed with crushing force, which is an unpleasantly elegant solution if you are on the receiving end of it. Early modelling estimated thousands of newtons of bite force even at the jaw tip, with greater force farther back along the blade edge, strong enough to deal with hard or armoured prey. In plain terms, this was an animal built not only to catch, but to break. The old nickname of a fish that could crush anything is a bit dramatic, certainly, but as far as dramatic titles go, this one did not entirely fail its entrance exam. There is, however, a delightful little complication here, because the closer paleontologists look at Dunkleosteus, the more they realise that some of its most famous modern reconstructions may have stretched things a bit. For many years it was often restored as an extremely long shark-like giant, sometimes reaching the sort of lengths that make documentary narrators lower their voices and say things like "larger than a bus," with visible satisfaction. More recent work has argued for a shorter, deeper, stockier body. Instead of a long torpedo with an armoured face, Dunkleosteus may have been more compact and more thick-set, with large adults around 4 metres, and the biggest known individuals likely not much beyond 5. That does not make it small. 4 metres of armoured bladed fish is still more than enough fish for one ecosystem, but it does change the feeling of the animal. It becomes less a giant spear with jaws and more a heavily built pelagic hunter, dense with muscle, power and unpleasant intent, which in some ways is even better. There is something about a predator that does not need to be absurdly oversized in order to be memorable. It simply needs to look like it means it. That newer picture also reminds us how fragmentary the fossil record can be. Much of what is known from Dunkleosteus comes from the armoured front end, the part most likely to preserve, while the rest of the body has long required inference and comparison. That means paleontologists are doing something halfway between science and detective work, except the witness statements are 360 million years old and most of the suspect has declined to remain on the scene. The result is that every improvement in reconstruction matters. A fin in the right place matters. The proportions of the trunk armour matter. The position of joints and muscle attachments matters. Piece by piece, the animal becomes less mythical and more real, which is often the strangest transformation of all. Monsters are easy to imagine. Actual organisms are harder. They have constraints, proportions, habits, biomechanics. They stop being symbols and begin to move in the mind like animals. And Dunkleosteus, for all its theatrical appearance, was not a fantasy. It was an operating predator in an operating world. That world was the late Devonian, and it deserves a moment of attention because no hunter, however memorable, exists in isolation. Around 382 to 359 million years ago, the seas were crowded with forms both familiar and deeply unfamiliar. Placoderms diversified. Early sharks were already in the mix. Ray-finned and lobe-finned fishes swam those waters too. Reefs flourished, though they would later suffer badly in the extinction crises that closed the Devonian. On land, forests were appearing, and some vertebrate lineages were edging toward the great transition out of water. It was a period of invention and pressure, of expansion and loss, and the oceans were full of opportunity for anything capable enough to seize it. Dunkleosteus did not arrive in a sleepy pond where it could dominate by default. It emerged in one of the great fish ages of Earth history, which makes its reputation more impressive. Being formidable in an empty room is not much of an achievement. Being formidable in the Devonian took work. Some of the best-known Dunkleosteus fossils come from Ohio, particularly from the Cleveland Shale, which has given the animal a curious double life. It is both a global prehistoric icon and, in a very particular sense, a local celebrity. The first fossils were discovered in 1867 by J. Terrell along the Lake Erie cliffs, and the species name Terrelli honours him. Later work by museum scientists in and around Cleveland expanded the record considerably, and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History now holds some of the best preserved material in the world. There is something rather charming about this. one of the great armoured predators of the Devonian, a beast built like an underwater guillotine, owes much of its fame to the patient work of people walking shale exposures in Ohio. Prehistory often feels distant until you realise it has addresses. It has road cuts. It has museum basements. It has names attached to the people who first bent down, picked something up and thought, that cannot be ordinary. And perhaps that is part of the enduring fascination here. Dunkleosteus is monstrous enough to stir the imagination, but specific enough to feel grounded. You can point to the fossils, you can study the jaw mechanics, you can debate the size estimates. You can stand in front of the armour and see the seams where plates met, the edges where bone became weapon. It is not just a spooky idea from a general ancient ocean. It is a real animal with a real history, and a surprisingly good fossil paper trail for something that last had a pulse before trees became ordinary neighbours on land. That blend of reality and strangeness is difficult to resist. A tyrannosaur is terrifying, certainly, but by now we almost expect giant reptiles to behave dramatically. A fish in armour that could shear through prey with self-sharpening bone edges feels less familiar, and for that reason perhaps more unsettling. It catches the mind off guard. Fish are not meant, in our daily assumptions, to look like siege equipment. There is another reason this animal matters, and it has less to do with raw menace than with timing. Dunkleosteus belongs to a very early chapter in the history of vertebrate predation at scale. Placoderms were among the dominant vertebrates of the Devonian, and Dunkleosteus has often been described as one of the earliest true apex predators among vertebrates. That phrase can sound a little grand, but it captures something real. By the time Dunkleosteus was cruising the upper water column, vertebrates were no longer simply trying to exist. Some of them were beginning to run ecosystems from the top. They were testing what jaws, armour, speed, and body design could do when assembled into a hunter with few apparent manners. In that sense, Dunkleosteus is not merely a bizarre dead fish. It is part of a larger story about escalation, about the point in natural history when vertebrates began getting truly serious with one another. Still, for all this talk of force and blades and hierarchy, I think the scene is worth softening for a moment before we go deeper. Imagine the water first. Not black, not stormy, not dramatic in a theatrical way. Just broad Devonian sea, warm and full of suspended life, with reefs below and open water ahead. Everything moving according to needs older than memory. Small fish turning, early sharks passing through, shelled animals drifting or pulsing, the light thinning as it sinks, and somewhere in that older world something armoured moves with enough control that the water seems to part around its decision. Not rushing, not frantic. It does not need to be. A body built this way is not improvising. It is arriving. The skull is plated. The neck joint is flexible. The mouth is closed for now, which somehow makes it worse. There is a peculiar comfort, I think, in studying an animal like this from several 100 million years away. It can no longer harm anything except perhaps your ability to look at modern fish without briefly wondering what else evolution has filed away in its archives. And so, as the evening settles a little more heavily, and the world outside your window goes on doing whatever time of night requires of it, we can let our attention drift further into that lost sea. There is still quite a lot waiting there. The world before dinosaurs did not lack drama. It simply arranged it differently. Its tyrants wore armour in unexpected places. Its killers did not always have teeth. Its oceans were crowded with experiments, some elegant, some bewildering, and some like Dunkleosteus, both at once. In a moment, the water around this animal will start to fill in. The Devonian will become less like a label in a textbook and more like a living place, with rivals, prey, reefs, hazards, and the slow turning pressures that made a fish like this possible. Once you begin to see that world properly, the animal at its centre starts to make much more sense, and also, rather inconveniently, becomes even more impressive. Long before any dinosaur put a foot on land, before there were birds overhead or whales in the sea or even grass doing its very ordinary business in a field, the world had already built an ocean full of ambition. The Devonian period lasted from about 419.2 million to 358.9 million years ago, and it is still known as the Age of Fishes because fish diversified so dramatically during that span. That label sounds tidy, almost museum-like, but the reality was much messier and much more interesting. The seas were crowded with armoured forms, early sharks, ray-finned fishes, lobe-finned fishes, shelled animals, reef builders, drifting hunters, and bottom dwellers, all participating in one of the most energetic marine worlds Earth had yet assembled. So when we step into the world of Dunkleosteus, we're not arriving at the beginning of life's story. We're entering a world that is already busy, competitive, and very much in motion. It is worth pausing over the phrase before the dinosaurs, because it helps reset the imagination. Dinosaurs would not appear until much later, in the Triassic, and that means the Devonian had to solve the problem of spectacle in its own way. It did not do so with giant reptiles. It did it with fish. Some were streamlined, some were plated, some were built like quiet torpedoes. Others looked as if evolution had rummaged through a box of spare parts, found some armour, found some jaws, and decided that subtlety was not the priority today. The result was a marine world that feels at once primitive and strangely advanced. Jaws were no longer a new experiment. They were becoming tools of specialisation, and in the Devonian, lineages began trying them out with real confidence. That is one reason the period feels so alive when you read about it. It is not full of hesitant prototypes. It is full of animals already taking bold positions in the food web. If you had somehow floated above one of those seas, you would not have seen a familiar blue world populated by the standard cast of modern marine life. No dolphins, no seals, no seabirds skimming the surface, no kelp forests swaying beneath the waves in the modern sense. The architecture of the sea was different. In shallow waters, tabulate corals and rugose corals helped build reefs, joined by stromatoporoids, sponge-like reef builders that were among the major engineers of Devonian marine ecosystems. Brachiopods were abundant. Crinoids added their own peculiar elegance, rooted or anchored in place like feathery machinery. Ammonoids appeared early in the Devonian, beginning a long and successful history of coiled-shelled cephalopods. Trilobites were still around as well, though their best days were behind them. It was a sea of reefs, shells, plates, spines and mouths, and nearly everything in it seems to have had either a defence, a trick, or a plan for bothering something else. The reefs themselves deserve a moment because they were not background decoration. They were major habitat. In the Middle Devonian, coral and stromatoporoid reef systems reached extraordinary levels of diversity and geographic spread. These were large, busy, productive communities where small animals could hide, graze, filter feed, or be eaten in a wide range of imaginative ways. Reef systems tend to create opportunities, and the Devonian was full of organisms ready to exploit them. Some crept over surfaces, some floated above them, some darted between structures, others waited for something smaller to make a poor decision. If you're trying to imagine the lost world of the Devonian, it helps not to picture a single broad emptiness, but rather a patchwork of marine neighbourhoods, reef zones, open water, coastal shallows, muddier basins, deeper settings, each with its own cast and its own hazards. Life was not spread evenly. It clustered, concentrated, and competed. That, after all, is how ecosystems become interesting. And then, of course, there were the fish. The Devonian earned its nickname honestly. Placoderms, the armoured fishes, were especially important. These were among the early jawed vertebrates, and many wore bony plates over the head and front of the body. Alongside them swam early sharks and the ancestors of groups that still matter greatly in the modern world, including ray-finned fishes and lobe-finned fishes. That last group is especially significant because lobe-finned fishes eventually gave rise to the first tetrapods. It is a useful reminder that while one branch of Devonian life was turning itself into apex marine predators, another branch was quietly laying groundwork for feet, limbs, and eventually every land vertebrate that would come after. The Devonian was not building only one future, it was building several at once, and some of them were stranger than others. This is one of the reasons the period feels so crowded when you study it. It is not merely rich in fossils, it is rich in turning points. In the oceans, vertebrates were expanding into roles that would shape ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. On land, things were changing too. Early in the Devonian, terrestrial plants were still relatively modest. By the end of the period, ferns, horsetails, seed plants, and the first true forests had appeared. Archaeopteris, often described as among the earliest true trees to form forests, had woody trunks, and could grow in floodplains and coastal lowlands. That may sound like a side note in a story about a giant armoured fish, but it is not. Once you begin growing real forests, you begin changing soils, runoff, river systems, and the chemistry of the wider planet. Trees do not merely decorate a landscape, they reorganise it. And this is where the Devonian becomes even more interesting, because the story of the sea cannot be separated from the story of the land. One major line of research suggests that the expansion of land plants in the late Devonian contributed to dramatic changes in marine biogeochemistry. As newly rooted landscapes altered soils and increased nutrient delivery to the oceans, marine systems may have become more vulnerable to oxygen loss, especially when combined with other stresses such as volcanism and climate instability. In plainer language, the greening of the continents may have helped make some parts of the sea harder to breathe in. It is not the sort of consequence a tree advertises, and it does make forests sound a bit more scheming than they probably deserve. But it is a good example of how connected Earth systems already were. What happened on land did not stay politely on land. Rivers carried the news, the oceans had to deal with it. Meanwhile, back in the water, the basic rules of life were becoming easier to recognise, even if the cast looked unusual. There were herbivores and grazers, ambush predators and open water hunters, prey animals built for quick turns, shelled animals built for defence, and larger hunters built to exploit both. There was no shortage of appetite. The Devonian seas were productive, but they were also full of things trying not to become a meal. If you enjoy the comfort of a modern aquarium, the Devonian would have challenged that comfort rather firmly. It was less a tranquil gallery of gentle fins and more a large ongoing argument about body plans. Armour said one thing, speed said another. Shells made their case, jaws replied, and over millions of years certain designs began to emerge as especially effective, which is where animals like Dunkleosteus start to feel less like a bizarre accident and more like the logical result of sustained competition. Late in the Devonian, the first tetrapods also appeared, meaning vertebrates were beginning to test life at the water's edge and beyond it. That fact can make the period feel transitional, and in one sense it was. But it would be a mistake to imagine the sea as somehow secondary during this time. The ocean was still the main stage. Land vertebrates were only beginning their long, awkward experiment with not being fully aquatic. The truly developed drama was still underwater. Reefs were thriving in many places. Open water systems were active. Fish diversity was high. Predator and prey were refining each other. If anything, the first tetrapods arriving at the margins only make the sea look more impressive, because it suggests that even while some vertebrates were cautiously peering onto mudflats and floodplains, the real centres of power were still moving beneath the waves. Now, if we narrow the view a little and drift toward the waters that would one day become part of North America, the scene becomes especially relevant to Dunkleosteus. The Cleveland Shale and related deposits have preserved one of the best-known windows into this late Devonian marine world. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History notes that northeast Ohio once lay beneath an ancient sea, and its Cleveland Shale collection preserves not just Dunkleosteus, but other fishes, early sharks, invertebrates, and even land plants washed in from nearby coasts. That last detail is especially useful. It tells you this was not an isolated fantasy ocean detached from the rest of the planet. It was connected to shorelines, weather, plant life, runoff, and all the familiar untidiness of a functioning world. Things died in the water, things drifted in from land, sediments settled, fossils formed. Eventually people in Ohio would find them and realise that their local rocks had once been part of a place far stranger than anyone would have guessed from the current view outside. The Cleveland Shale also gives us an important clue about the character of the water column. Recent reconstruction work describes it as a black shale with a distinct absence of benthic life and bioturbation, suggesting a highly stratified water column with nectonic animals living over an anoxic bottom. In simpler terms, the lower waters and seafloor conditions were starved of oxygen, while the upper part of the system still supported active swimmers. That matters for atmosphere. It means this was not necessarily a cheerful, sparkling coastal postcard. In some places the Devonian Sea could be layered and uneasy, with life concentrated in more habitable water above a deeper zone that was largely hostile to bottom-dwelling communities. There is something very effective about that setup if you're trying to preserve fossils, and rather less effective if you happen to be a creature fond of living on the seabed. It also adds a subtle menace to the world Dunkleosteus inhabited. The sea was not only full of predators. In places the environment itself had sharp edges. That sort of setting may help explain why the Devonian can feel both lush and severe at the same time. On one hand, it produced reefs, fish radiations, early forests, and the first tetrapods. On the other, it was heading toward repeated ecological crises. The late Devonian was marked by prolonged climate instability and major marine disruptions, including extinction pulses around the Frasnian-Furmenian boundary, often referred to as the Kellwasser events, and another major crisis near the end of the Devonian, the Hangenberg event. Researchers continue to debate the exact balance of causes, but widespread anoxia, nutrient loading, climate change, and possibly volcanism all feature prominently in the discussion. What matters for our purposes is not just that extinctions happened, but that the Devonian world was dynamic right up to the point of being dangerous. It was not a settled paradise waiting patiently for the future. It was a world capable of enormous productivity and equally enormous disruption. Reef communities were among the great casualties of those disruptions. Research and syntheses on Devonian life make clear that tabulate corals, rugose corals, and stromatoporoid reef systems were major features of the period, and later work on the end-Devonian crises shows how severely reef ecosystems collapsed. This is one of those changes that sounds technical until you picture what it means. A reef is not one animal, it is a city. Collapse a reef system and you do not merely lose scenery. You lose shelter, nursery grounds, feeding spaces, and the countless interactions that grow around long-lived structure. The Devonian seas, for all their richness, were therefore also vulnerable in a very modern-seeming way. Large ecosystems built over long spans can still be brought low by environmental stress. The details differ. The principle is familiar. Life builds, flourishes, overreaches, adjusts, and sometimes loses ground very quickly. What I like about spending time in this older sea is that it rearranges our sense of what counts as ancient. We often flatten prehistory into a single remote blur, as though everything before the dinosaurs belongs in the same dim storage box. But the Devonian was not a rough draft of later eras. It was its own finished world with its own rules. Its reefs were not placeholders. Its fish were not rehearsals. Its forests were not decorative side experiments. Everything alive then was as current to its moment as gulls and buses and supermarket apples are to ours. And in that world, if you were a mid-sized animal trying to stay uneaten, you did not care in the slightest that some future age would later prefer to put giant reptiles on lunchboxes. Your problem was the thing already in the water with you. The thing armoured at the front, fast at the mouth, and entirely uninterested in your hopes. Even the ordinary details of that sea start to feel more vivid the longer you sit with them. Picture schools of fish moving through light that never touched a modern coastline. Picture reefs crowded with corals and stromatoporoids, brachiopods filtering nearby, ammonoids drifting or jetting through the water, and early sharks already testing their own solutions to hunting. Picture coastal plants shedding fragments into rivers, those fragments washing seaward, settling at last into mud that would harden over immense spans into shale. None of this required an audience. None of it knew it was laying down evidence for museums and papers and slightly sleepy internet videos. It was simply a marine world doing what marine worlds do, minute by minute, mouthful by mouthful, death by death, growth by growth. That is one of the quietly useful things fossils teach us. The past was not arranged for our benefit. It was busy with itself. And because it was busy with itself, it also produced specialists. Not everything could be average in such a setting. Competition has a way of rewarding clarity. Some creatures solve survival with armour, some with mobility, some with body shape, some with shell form, some with feeding tricks, some with simply being too awkward to bother. But a few solved it by becoming unmistakably dangerous. Those are the animals that hold the eye longest, and not always because they were the largest. Sometimes it's enough to be built with a very clear purpose. Dunkleosteus belongs to that category. Once you understand the Devonian properly, once you see that this was a sea full of reefs, rival fishes, early sharks, shelled prey, changing chemistry and uneven oxygen conditions, the animal stops looking like an isolated oddity and starts looking like a product of pressure. Of course, a world like this would eventually make something like Dunkleosteus. A crowded age of fishes was hardly going to end with everyone behaving sensibly. So, as the water settles around us a little more, and the Devonian begins to feel less like a label and more like a place, it becomes easier to focus on one moving shape within it. Not the whole sea now, but a single answer to that sea. A body designed for open water, a front end plated in bone, a head that does not so much wear armour as become it. The reefs, the early forests, the oxygen-poor depths, the swarms of fish, the rise of sharks, the restless pressure of a world before dinosaurs, all of it forms the backdrop for what comes next. And now that the setting is in place, the animal itself can step forward properly, because this lost world did not merely contain Dunkleosteus. It built the conditions for a fish like that to make very good use of its face. The Devonian Sea did not build Dunkleosteus by halves. It did not give the animal a dangerous bite and then wrap the rest in something ordinary. It gave it a front end that looked prepared for disagreement. If most fish seem shaped by water first and conflict second, Dunkleosteus gives the opposite impression. You notice the armour before you notice the fish. You notice the edges before you think about motion. You notice that this animal appears to have been assembled from plates, hinges, and intent. It is one of those extinct creatures that makes modern design look a bit timid. Nature, left to its own devices for long enough, can produce something that resembles a swimming siege engine, and still classify it, quite correctly, as a fish. The formal name for animals like Dunkleosteus is placoderm, from Greek roots meaning plate skin, and that is not one of those over-enthusiastic scientific names that promises more than it delivers. Placoderms were armoured-jawed fishes, especially successful in the Devonian, and many of them wore bony dermal plates over the head and front of the body. Dunkleosteus belonged to a subgroup called Arthrodires, a name that points toward one of their most useful structural tricks, a movable joint between the armoured head region and the armoured trunk region. So even before you get to the famous jaws, there is already something unusual going on. This was not just a fish with bone over its face. It was a fish whose body armour had articulation built into it, like a piece of protective engineering that still needed to hunt for a living. That joint matters because armour is always a negotiation. The more heavily you protect an animal, the more you risk making it rigid, slow, and inconveniently bad at the very activities needed to stay alive. Dunkleosteus and its relatives worked around that problem by dividing the bony shield into functional regions. The skull roof, cheek region, and lower jaw formed the forward battery. Behind that sat the trunk armour, another set of large plates covering the front of the body. Between them was the craniothoracic joint, the famous arthrodire hinge, which allowed movement between head and trunk while preserving the protective value of the armour. In plain language, the animal did not simply wear a helmet, it wore a system. You could not have built a better arrangement if your goal had been to give a predator the manners of a tank and the flexibility of a trap. Seen from the front, Dunkleosteus can look almost absurdly over-equipped. The skull is broad and plated, the cheeks are shielded, the lower jaw is deep. The front of the trunk continues the armoured look so convincingly that the animal can seem less like a fish with armour and more like armour that has decided to become a fish. But the fossil material and recent reconstruction work make clear that this was not random heaviness. The trunk armour of Dunkleosteus is unusually deep among arthrodires, and newer reconstructions suggest a shorter, deeper, sturdier body than the long, shark-like restorations that became popular in older books and museum art. That changes the feel of the whole animal. It becomes less a stretched monster and more a compact, muscular, open-water predator, built with density and authority rather than theatrical length. There is something satisfying about that newer picture, because it makes the armour seem even more believable. A long body with an overbuilt front can look speculative, almost decorative, as though the fossil record has bullied the imagination into adding too much flourish behind the preserved bones. A shorter and deeper body fits the evidence better and gives the armoured front a proper partner. The animal begins to look balanced in its own severe way. A heavy chest, a powerful forward section, a swimming profile suited to an active predator. It stops resembling an exaggerated story told at a museum gift shop and starts looking like something that actually moved through water with purpose, which of course is exactly what it was. The fossils are not just strange, they are functional. And then there are the so-called blades, which are not a journalist's embellishment so much as a fair description of what the jaws were doing. Dunkleosteus did not rely on separate true teeth in the familiar shark or crocodile sense. Instead, it had sharpened bony jaw plates whose edges functioned as cutting surfaces. Museum descriptions note that these edges sharpen themselves as opposing surfaces war against each other. That is one of those details that manages to be efficient and alarming at the same time. A shark loses and replaces teeth. Dunkleosteus seems to have simplified the arrangement and turned the jaws themselves into the weapon. It is a bit like replacing a cutlery drawer with a single pair of industrial shears and then deciding that was all the kitchen really needed. The shape of those jaw plates is part of what makes the head look so deliberate. They do not give the impression of nibbling, browsing, or uncertain experimentation. They look built to cut. In some views, the lower plates project in a way that suggests a snapping tool, and this impression is not merely aesthetic. Biomechanical work on Dunkleosteus has shown that its feeding apparatus combined rapid jaw opening with a powerful closing stroke, making it one of the earliest vertebrate predators known to pair strong bite forces with fast suction-assisted prey capture. This is worth lingering over, because it means the armour was not a passive shell draped over a brute. The armoured head housed a kinetic feeding machine. The plates protected something active and fast, not merely something stubborn. That speed is one of the most useful correctives to the old mental image of Dunkleosteus as a lumbering brute. Armour often makes us imagine slowness. It should, really. Most of us are not used to heavily plated things also being quick, unless we have recently stepped on a very determined vacuum cleaner. But Dunkleosteus appears to have opened its jaws extremely rapidly, with one classic study estimating about 20 milliseconds to open the mouth, and roughly 50 to 60 milliseconds for the feeding strike as a whole. Rapid opening would have helped generate suction, pulling prey inward just as the cutting plates came together. In other words, the fish did not simply bite what was in front of it. It likely helped pull prey into a very bad situation before closing the deal. There is a certain professionalism to that arrangement. The hinge at the top of the head also deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it is part of what made the whole face work. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History notes that Dunkleosteus had a hinge at the top of the head that allowed both upper and lower jaws to move, helping the mouth open to around 45 degrees. For a modern human mouth, that would be an absurd and medically inconvenient party trick. For Dunkleosteus, it was a feeding solution. The Arthrodire skull was not a rigid box with one flap at the bottom. It was a coordinated structure in which head and jaw motion work together. That makes the animal's face less like a standard fish mouth and more like a mechanism with moving parts, one plate lifting, another rotating, the whole front end behaving with a sort of engineered logic. All of this also changes how the armour itself should be imagined. It was not smooth plating in the modern fantasy sense, as though the fish had been gift-wrapped by a metalworker with excellent patience. These were dermal bones with sutures, shapes, contact surfaces, and growth histories. They were living tissue while the animal lived, part of a developmental and functional anatomy, not dead hardware bolted on afterward. Recent reconstruction figures show the distribution of dermal bone and preserved cartilaginous components across the skull and trunk, emphasizing just how much of the famous Dunkleosteus appearance is rooted in real preserved structure. That matters because there is a temptation with iconic fossils to think of the dramatic parts as artistic exaggeration. In this case, the dramatic parts really were there. If anything, the challenge is not to over-dramatize them, but to remember they belong to an actual animal that had to swim, feed, and keep its internal organs from becoming someone else's evening. The armour also likely changed how other animals read it. Prey species do not conduct formal measurements, but they do respond to shape, movement, approach angle, and the general unpleasantness of what is coming toward them. An armoured head with broad plates and a deep jaw creates a very different silhouette from that of a narrow-snouted predator. Dunkleosteus may have looked less like a dart and more like an advancing hazard. There is a practical side to that. Armour protects against impact, struggling prey, and perhaps attacks from rivals. But there is probably also a visual and behavioural consequence. A predator that looks heavily built at the front may not need to hide its nature. It may benefit from directness. If the mouth can open fast enough and cut hard enough, there is less need for elegance. The design can afford to be blunt about its intentions. Of course, there is a limit to how much certainty we should pretend to have. Dunkleosteus is famous, but fame is not the same as completeness. Much of the best preserved material comes from the armoured front portion, which means the posterior body has historically required more reconstruction and comparison with related arthrodires. That is exactly why recent work on body shape and proportions has been so important. Older images tended to make the unknown parts long and shark-like. Newer analyses lean toward a shorter, deeper, more thunniform or lamnid-like body plan for active swimming in open water. The basic lesson here is refreshingly humbling. Even when a fossil animal is world famous, paleontologists may still be arguing over whether it looked more like an underwater limousine or a hostile barrel with fins. Science improves by becoming less impressed with its first guesses. That said, the front half is more than enough to establish character. The head and trunk armour alone make Dunkleosteus memorable in a way very few fish ever become. A salmon is admirable. A tuna is impressive. A swordfish is admittedly making an effort. But none of them look like they are wearing the front wall of a fortress. Dunkleosteus does. The bony shield gives the entire animal an expression of permanence, as though it expected the sea to argue with it and had dressed accordingly. Even at rest, at least in the imagination, it would have looked prepared. That is one reason it works so well in popular culture. The creature comes preloaded with visual intent. Artists barely have to embellish. The fossil has already done most of the work. There is also something deeply Devonian about the whole arrangement. This was an age in which early jawed vertebrates were experimenting with armour, feeding mechanics, and ecological roles on a large scale. Dunkleosteus was not alone in being strange. It simply happened to become one of the most imposing expressions of a broader anatomical trend. Arthrodyras in general show that plecoderm armour did not prevent innovation in movement and feeding. The group explored ways of linking protection with function, and Dunkleosteus represents one of the clearest cases where those experiments converged on a top predator. It was not armoured despite being active. It was armoured as part of the total package that made activity possible in a competitive marine setting. That is a different way of thinking about body design. The plates were not compensation, they were participation. It helps at this point to picture the animal in profile, not the old stretched version first, but the newer, stockier one, a deep armoured front, a heavy skull roof, cheek plates framing the bite, trunk armour descending behind the head in solid geometry, then the body continuing backward into a more conventional fish form, though still one built for open water. Nothing about that outline is wasteful. Nothing about it looks decorative. Even the severe look of the head probably emerges from practical demands, protecting muscle attachments, resisting feeding loads, managing joint motion, giving the animal enough structural confidence to strike hard and withstand the consequences. When bodies begin to look this purposeful, they often end up being remembered as monsters. That is partly fair and partly our own fault. We are very susceptible to any design that seems to have been drafted by someone who mistrusted softness. There is a pleasant irony in calling it a fish in a suit of blades, because the image sounds a little too tailored, a little too intentional, as though Dunkleosteus had dressed up specifically to make a point at a formal marine event. Yet the phrase works because the animal really does seem outfitted. The armour is not all over the body in equal fashion. It is concentrated where it matters most for impact, feeding and defence. The jaw edges are not randomly sharp. They are maintained cutting surfaces. The hinge is not decorative. It increases functional gape and motion. In that sense, the fish does look suited for a job, and the job appears to have involved swimming through the Devonian while making the local prey base deeply unhappy. And still, for all the force packed into the front end, it is the combination of traits that keeps the animal from becoming just another oversized fossil celebrity. A huge bite by itself would be notable. Armour alone would be notable. A kinetic skull would be notable. Put them together, and the animal stops being merely large or dangerous and becomes mechanically interesting. That is usually the point where extinct animals gain a second kind of power over the imagination. They do not just look frightening, they make you curious. How did that work? How did those plates move? How did the muscle sit under the armour? How did the head open so fast? How did a fish arrive at this arrangement so early in vertebrate history? Once those questions start turning over in the mind, the fossil stops being a poster creature and becomes a problem worth lingering over. That is where we find ourselves now, hovering just before the mouth fully takes over the story, because the armour may be what first commands attention, but the jaws are where Dunkleosteus becomes truly unreasonable. A plated skull can still belong to a cautious animal. A deep armoured front can still be mostly about defence. The moment the feeding mechanism enters the picture in full, all such gentler possibilities begin to leave the room. The head was not a shield with a fish attached. It was the forward half of a cutting machine. And once that machine opens, once those bony edges begin acting less like ordinary anatomy and more like sharpened tools, the whole animal shifts from impressive to difficult to ignore, which is exactly where the next part begins. What made Dunkleosteus so unsettling was not simply that it had a large mouth. Plenty of animals have large mouths. A whale shark has a large mouth and remains to most of us a deeply reassuring citizen of the sea. What made Dunkleosteus different was the feeling that its entire front end had been designed around the act of biting. The head was armoured. The lower jaw was deep. The cutting surfaces were built directly into the jaws themselves. It did not look like a fish that happened to eat meat. It looked like a fish whose face had been reorganised around the efficient ending of arguments. In a Devonian ocean full of hard parts, armoured bodies, and other fish making their own serious contributions to the food web, that was not a small advantage. The first surprise is that Dunkleosteus did not rely on tooth rows in the familiar way. If you picture a shark's conveyor belt of replacement teeth, or a crocodile's tidy arrangement of stabbing cones set that image aside. Dunkleosteus used exposed bony jaw plates, often described as blade-like or scissor-like cutting surfaces. These edges were part of the jaw apparatus itself rather than a neat set of separate enamel tools. That alone gives the mouth a different character. It was not a mouth packed with knives, it was a mouth that had become the knife. Museum descriptions and paleontological discussions both emphasise the same point. The business end of the animal was not a row of teeth, but a pair of sharpened, opposing blades built from bone. That is where the phrase jaws without teeth becomes useful, even if it needs a little care. It does not mean the mouth was blunt or soft or somehow unfinished. Quite the opposite. The cutting edges on the upper and lower jaw plates could shear against one another in a way that behaved much like heavy shears. Ohio History and the Cleveland Museum both describe those edges as self-sharpening, because repeated opening and closing would keep the exposed surfaces honed. It is a deeply efficient solution. Instead of replacing damaged tooth crowns one by one, the animal carried cutting edges that maintained themselves through use. That is a wonderfully practical arrangement if your daily routine involves gripping struggling prey and putting hard material under stress. There is something bluntly sensible about evolution arriving at that answer. In a crowded marine world, anything that can cut through resistant prey quickly has a real advantage. Teeth are one way to do that. Turning parts of the jaw skeleton into a permanent cutting tool is another. Dunkleosteus did not need a mouth full of delicate points if the whole closing surface could function like a sharpened chisel or a pair of blades. It is less ornate than a shark's smile, but perhaps more severe for that very reason. Sharks look armed. Dunkleosteus looked equipped. There is a difference. One suggests danger, the other suggests a job already underway. Of course, a cutting edge is only half the story. A blade lying on a table is not much of a threat unless someone picks it up and uses it properly. The real question is how the jaws moved. For many years, one of the most influential ideas about Dunkleosteus came from biomechanical work published in 2007, which modelled the skull as a highly kinetic structure with a unique 4-bar linkage system. In that interpretation, connections among the skull, lower jaw, thoracic shield, and jaw muscles allowed extremely rapid mouth opening, on the order of about 20 milliseconds, with the full strike completed in about 50 to 60 milliseconds. The same model also estimated very high bite forces, enough to make the animal one of the most formidable biters known among fishes. That older model became famous for good reason. It gave Dunkleosteus a mouth that was not merely powerful but startlingly quick. Rapid jaw opening can matter a great deal in water because it helps create low pressure and pull prey inward. In simple terms, if the mouth opens fast enough, the surrounding water rushes in, and anything unfortunate enough to be nearby can get drawn toward the throat just as the jaws are closing. This is why the early interpretation of Dunkleosteus was so compelling. It seemed to combine several useful things at once: speed, force, and a feeding strike that was not just a snap but a controlled hydraulic event. That combination is one reason people began speaking of the animal with such alarmed respect. The bite force numbers also helped fix its reputation. The 2007 study estimated more than 4,400 newtons at the jaw tip and more than 5,300 newtons farther back along the blade edge, with larger values proposed for larger individuals. The authors argued that these forces would have been sufficient to puncture or cut through cuticle and dermal armour, suggesting prey that included hard-bodied or armoured animals such as other placoderms and ammonoids. That is the point at which Dunkleosteus stops sounding like a generalised predator and starts sounding like a very particular answer to a very particular Devonian problem. The sea was not short on prey with defences. Dunkleosteus appears to have met those defences with a face designed to treat them as inconveniences. Still, one of the most interesting things about paleontology is that even the most famous animals can be revised. In late 2025, a new anatomical study re-examined the jaw mechanism and argue that parts of the older feeding model may not reflect Dunkleosteus anatomy as accurately as once thought. That reassessment suggested a wider gape than many older reconstructions allowed, perhaps at least 65 to 70 degrees, and argued that the animal may have been less like a classic suction feeder and more like a predator that bit with a wide gape and then orally processed prey. In other words, the fish may have been opening even wider than once supposed, but not necessarily using suction in quite the way earlier models proposed. The exact mechanics are still being refined, which is a healthy sign, not a problem. It means the fossil is still teaching us new things. That newer interpretation actually makes the mouth feel no less impressive. If anything, it changes the image from a quick vacuum-assisted snap to something more openly brutal. A wide gape combined with sharp jaw plates suggests a predator capable of seizing prey, cutting into it, and breaking it down with strong oral processing. The 2025 study also argued that major parts of the skull and jaw system involved more cartilage and soft tissue reconstruction than earlier simplified models allowed, which matters because it changes how paleontologists think about muscle placement, joint motion, and realistic feeding behaviour. The result is not a less dangerous animal. It is an animal whose danger may have worked a little differently from the cleanest old diagrams. There is something very fitting in that. Real predators are often more complicated than their posters. Either way, the lower jaw of Dunkleosteus remains one of the great pieces of prehistoric design. Fossil jaw plates, especially the infragnathal, show a deep lower structure with a sharp beveled edge and a projecting front portion, sometimes informally compared to a tusk or a hooked point. Cincinnati Museum Center notes this clearly in its discussion of its specimen, and once you see that shape, it becomes difficult to unsee it. The lower jaw does not look suited to nibbling or stripping small items from surfaces. It looks built to engage, hold, and cut. There is a directness to it that even many later predators do not quite match. The mouth presents itself as a tool before it presents itself as anatomy. It also helps to remember where this mouth was mounted. Dunkleosteus was not a little head attached to a giant anonymous body. Recent reconstruction work argues for a shorter, deeper, more powerfully built animal than older long-bodied restoration suggested. That matters because the jaws now sit in the mind's eye on a fish that feels more compact and more committed to its front half. The body supports the face. The face rewards the body. A long, slender animal with shearing jaw plates would be one kind of threat. A shorter, deeper pelagic hunter with an armoured forebody and those same plates feels like something else entirely. It feels like a machine that got smaller, only so it could become denser. There is also the question of prey resistance, which is where the living guillotine comparison begins to earn its keep. A guillotine, grim though the reference is not simply a sharp edge. It is a system for concentrating force cleanly and decisively through a constrained path. Dunkleosteus was not literally chopping vertically, of course, but its bladed jaw plates and strong closing bite created a similar sense of mechanical finality. This was not a mouth built to worry away at soft tissue for minutes on end. It appears to have been built to deliver a damaging cut quickly, to overcome resistant prey surfaces, and to leave the prey in much worse condition almost immediately. The difference between a mere bite and a structural cut is important. One injures, the other solves. That helps explain why the animal remains so memorable even among extinct predators. Many famous fossil hunters are remembered for size. Dunkleosteus is remembered for the mouth itself. People can be vague about the exact length of the fish, the date of the rocks, or the details of arthrodire anatomy, but they remember the face. They remember that it did not have normal teeth. They remember that the jaws sharpened themselves. They remember that it could open quickly and bite hard. Those are very sticky details. The brain tends to hold on to creatures that seem to have replaced something ordinary with something much less reassuring. In the case of Dunkleosteus, ordinary teeth were apparently deemed unnecessary. The jawbone would do. It is tempting at this point to picture the animal attacking everything in sight with wild enthusiasm. but that is probably not the best image. Good predators are not chaotic. They are selective, efficient, and usually rather conservative with effort. A mouth like this would have been expensive to power and maintain, even with self-sharpening edges. The most sensible picture is not of constant frenzy, but of controlled application. The fish closes in, the mouth opens in a wide and deliberate arc. The prey is caught or drawn close, the blades meet, damage is done quickly. That is more consistent with what we know of successful marine predators generally. Terrifying, yes, but not theatrical for the sake of it. Nature rarely wastes that kind of energy. Another useful point is that Dunkleosteus did not evolve in a world of soft, defenceless meals floating around for anyone with a mouth. Devonian seas were full of armoured fishes, shelled cephalopods, and a wide range of prey types with some degree of protection or escapability. That ecological background makes the mouth easier to understand. A predator facing resistant prey benefits from concentrated cutting force. Sharp, durable jaw plates make sense in that setting. So does a skull and neck arrangement that lets the mouth open wide and close strongly. The head of Dunkleosteus was not a random monster design. It was a practical response to a sea already full of hard edges. The difference is that its answer happened to be especially severe. The more you think about it, the stranger the whole arrangement becomes in a very concrete way. Modern fishes give us plenty of feeding strategies. Protrusible mouths, filter feeding, crushing plates, slicing teeth, grasping cones. Dunkleosteus sits slightly off to the side of those familiar categories. Its mouth was neither a shark replica, nor a giant parrotfish beak, nor a crocodile imitation. It belongs to an older set of vertebrate experiments, one in which early jawed fishes were trying combinations of armour, linkage, cutting surfaces, and gait mechanics that later lineages did not necessarily keep. That is one reason the animal can feel so fresh even now. It is not merely dangerous in a familiar way, it is dangerous by means of a design path that mostly vanished. There is also a very human reason the mouth lends so strongly. Teeth are easy for us to understand. We have them. We know what they do. A jaw that works like sharpened bone shears is less familiar, and unfamiliar dangers tend to linger. They require a second mental pass. You do not simply file Dunkleosteus under big fish and move on. You stop and ask, hold on, what exactly am I looking at here? That pause is part of the animal's grip on the imagination. Its weapons are not hidden. They are right there at the front, obvious and strange, waiting for the brain to accept that yes, this really was a vertebrate mouth and yes, it really did seem to work. As for the old comparison to a living guillotine, it survives because it captures the blunt mechanical confidence of the thing, not the exact motion, not the engineering diagram, but the mood of it. A guillotine is alarming because it reduces a body to a line, a blade, and a result. Dunkleosteus had that same economy in its face. There was not much ornament to distract you. There was armour, hinge, blade, closure. The parts were different from any human machine, but the impression was similar. This was a predator whose mouth looked as though it had already solved the question of what to do once prey was within reach. And if later studies continue adjusting the details of that solution, the overall effect remains unchanged. The mouth was not a rumour, it was the point. Once that sinks in, the next thought arrives almost automatically. Fine, the mouth was built to cut. Fine, it could open wide and close hard. Fine, it may have handled prey with a mixture of gape, force, and oral processing that made Devonian life uncomfortably eventful for everything nearby. But what did that actually mean in practice? How hard could it bite? What could those blades get through? What sort of shell, armour or bone would hold? And what sort would simply stop being a meaningful obstacle the moment those jaws came together? That is where the story naturally turns next, because once you have spent enough time staring at the mechanism, it becomes very difficult not to ask what happened when it finally closed. The real problem with a mouth like Dunkleosteus had is that once you understand the mechanics, the old dramatic language stops sounding dramatic enough. People say it could crush bone, shell and armour, and that sounds like the sort of thing a documentary narrator might say while the music grows ominous and the camera pushes in on a fossil jaw. But in this case, the line is not doing much exaggerating. The better biomechanical studies and museum summaries all point in the same basic direction. This was not a predator built merely to puncture soft prey and shake it around a bit. It was built to put serious stress through resistant materials. It was built for prey that fought back by being hard to cut, hard to pierce, or hard to break. And Dunkleosteus, being an annoyingly effective answer to that problem, seems to have regarded those defences less as barriers and more as things to test. The easiest way to understand that bite is to stop picturing ordinary fish mouths. Most of us, when we imagine a fish attack, think of rows of teeth, a snap, maybe a shake, perhaps a cinematic cloud of smaller fish politely scattering on cue. Dunkleosteus did something different. Its exposed bony jaw plates formed sharpened cutting edges, and when those edges came together, they did not behave like a mouthful of little points. They behaved more like heavy bladed tools. The Ohio Geological Survey describes the upper and lower jaws as sharpened exposed bone used to shear through prey, while the Cleveland Museum emphasises that the edges effectively sharpen themselves with use. So the bite was not simply strong in a general sense. It was concentrated through surfaces designed to cut and withstand force. That changes everything. A strong bite delivered through blunt anatomy can still be clumsy. A strong bite delivered through sharpened bone becomes a much more specific kind of bad news. The 2007 biomechanical work that made Dunkleosteus famous estimated maximal bite forces of over 4,400 newtons at the jaw tip and more than 5,300 newtons farther back along the blade edge for a large individual, with the paper arguing that these forces were enough to puncture and fragment hard materials such as cuticle or dermal bone. Popular reporting on the follow-up paleobiology work later summarised even higher modelled values, around 6,170 newtons at the front of the jaws and roughly 7,495 newtons at the rear blade area, depending on where the force was measured and how the mechanics were modelled. The exact number is less important than the pattern. However you slice it, and Dunkleosteus would probably have preferred that phrasing, the bite lands in the category of extremely powerful for an aquatic vertebrate of its size. It was not a little better than average. It was built to be one of the standouts. This is the part where people understandably want a comparison, because newtons are useful but not very cosy. They sit there on the page with all the warmth of a parking notice, so let us translate. A bite in that range, focused through sharp, bony edges, is enough to stop shell and armour from feeling like reliable life insurance. The original authors argued that such a bite could puncture or cut through the dermal armour of other placoderms. The Ohio Geological Survey states plainly that it could have pierced the armour of other placoderms and hard shells of ammonoid cephalopods. Those are not soft-body victims. Those are animals that entered the Devonian arms race already wearing protection. Dunkleosteus appears to have answered that protection by treating the mouth itself as a structural tool. It did not merely clamp. It imposed force where the prey most hoped force would not go. Bone is especially worth talking about because it sounds, to modern ears, like the final line in the list. Bone is what you get through after everything else has already gone badly wrong. Yet Dunkleosteus seems to have been quite prepared for that stage of the evening. The bony jaw plates were not just narrow edges for slicing flesh. Newer discussion of the jaws notes that they could slice flesh and crush bones, while the 2025 anatomical reassessment describes the mouth parts as tusk-like and bladed, more consistent with seizing and orally processing prey than with simply vacuuming it downhole. That suggests a predator capable not just of delivering an opening strike, but of continuing the work inside the mouth, reducing large prey pieces into more manageable sections. It is a useful reminder that feeding is not only about catching, it is also about what happens after the catch, when a predator has to turn a struggling body or a resistant shell into something it can actually swallow. Dunkleosteus seems to have been very competent at that second part as well. and this is where the animal begins to feel less like a fish and more like an industrial process with fins. Many predators kill by puncturing vital tissue. Some kill by holding and drowning. Some kill by tearing. Dunkleosteus appears to have been equipped for cutting into resistant prey and then processing the resulting pieces. There is a practical brutality in that arrangement. A shell is not there to stop a predator forever. It is there to make the effort unrewarding. Armour is not invincibility, it is persuasion. It tells the hunter, please choose something else. What makes Dunkleosteus so memorable is that the evidence suggests it often did not choose something else. It had the hardware to keep going. In a sea full of shelled cephalopods, armoured fishes and other animals that had invested quite a lot in not being easy to eat, that would have made it an unusually difficult customer. The old suction feeding model made this even more unnerving, because it suggested the fish could open its mouth in as little as 20 milliseconds, potentially creating pressure change sufficient to draw prey inward before the blades closed. That combination of fast opening and forceful closure is part of why the classic Anderson and Westneat work had such impact. A predator that can both get prey into the mouth quickly and then apply heavy cutting force is solving two problems at once. It is not enough to have a strong bite if you are slow to line it up. It is not enough to be fast if the prey you catch is still too armoured to matter. Dunkleosteus, in that view, paired acquisition and destruction rather neatly. The mouth was not just a trap, it was the whole workflow. More recent work complicates that picture in interesting ways. The 2025 reassessment argues that the exact feeding mechanism may have differed from the classic suction-heavy interpretation, and that the bite force itself may need re-evaluation, because the skull and jaw system involved more cartilage and soft tissue complexity than earlier simplified models captured. The same study suggests a wider gape, perhaps at least 65 to 70 degrees, and feeding behaviour more consistent with ram feeding and oral processing. That might sound like a retreat from the old monster story, but it is really just an upgrade in detail. Whether the fish relied more on suction or more on a wide gape seize and process strategy, the important point remains unchanged. The mouth was built to deal with large resistant prey, not merely nibble at soft targets. The precise equations may shift. The unpleasantness does not. There is a helpful modern instinct to be cautious whenever a fossil animal gets called the strongest, or biggest, or deadliest anything. Paleontology has had its share of dramatic headlines, and some of them have aged about as gracefully as old claymation. In Dunkleosteus, though, caution still leaves you with a very formidable picture. Even if later studies revise the exact force values downward or redistribute how stress moved through the skull, the observed anatomy still gives you a bladed mouth, a broad gape, and strong processing ability directed at hard or armoured prey. The Ohio Geological Survey still treats placoderm armour and ammonoid shells as plausible targets. Nautilus's report on the 2025 paper still describes jaws suited to slicing flesh and breaking bones. So the case does not depend on one sensational statistic. It rests on a broader anatomical pattern. This was a predator whose bite was shaped for resistance. That phrase, shaped for resistance, is, I think, the key to this whole section. Many animals can injure, many can bruise, grip, or puncture, but a mouth designed to work against resistant prey tells you something deeper about the ecosystem it evolved in. Devonian seas were not full of soft, convenient packages drifting around with little labels saying, "For apex predator." They contained armoured placoderms, hard-shelled ammonoids, bony fishes, primitive sharks, and a range of animals that came with problems attached. Dunkleosteus looks like the kind of predator you get when prey has already been difficult for a very long time. It is not the first move in an arms race. It is a later, more annoyed move. You can almost feel the evolutionary mood behind it. Fine. If everything is wearing protection now, then the mouth will become the cutting device. Problem addressed. There is another part of the bite story that often gets less attention than it deserves, and that is where along the jaws the force mattered most. The classic modelling showed stronger forces toward the rear blade area than at the very tip, which makes functional sense. Many jaws work as levers. The farther back the prey item is positioned, the greater the mechanical advantage for crushing and cutting. That means Dunkleosteus may have had options. A forward strike could seize or initiate damage. A deeper repositioning in the mouth could bring prey into zones of stronger force where the bladed surfaces did their most serious work. That is one of the reasons the animal starts to feel less like a simple chopper and more like a processor. Catching prey is one motion. Reducing it is another, and the mouth seems capable of both. This also helps explain why the phrase crush anything, while obviously a little too broad in the literal sense, does capture the mood of the animal. No predator crushes everything. Evolution is not in the habit of issuing universal permissions. There would always have been limits of size, angle, target choice, and risk. A large, active predator still has to avoid wasting energy or injuring itself. But if you were a medium-sized Devonian animal, relying mainly on shell, dermal armour, or bony resistance to stay uneaten, Dunkleosteus represented a category of threat that your strategy was badly suited to. It was not a predator deterred by hard surfaces, it was specialised around them. There is a difference between being eaten by something with ordinary teeth and being eaten by something whose mouth was, in effect, a pair of self-maintaining shears with a very large engine behind them. Even juvenile Dunkleosteus appear to have been built with this general logic in mind. Secondary summaries of ontogenetic work note that juvenile lower jaws were proportionally robust and likely already capable of generating high bite forces relative to their size, suggesting that resistant prey processing was not an adult-only talent but part of the animal's developmental design. That is a rather rude detail from the prey's perspective. It means the species may not have needed to wait for full adult proportions before becoming mechanically troublesome. Some predators grow into menace gradually. Dunkleosteus seems to have gotten started early, which is the sort of thing that makes evolutionary success look suspiciously well organised. Of course, the fossil record rarely hands us a perfect feeding video with clear subtitles and a helpful replay angle. What it gives us instead is a mix of anatomy, mechanics, comparative study, and occasional direct clues. Museum and state survey materials point to likely prey, including other placoderms, bony fishes, primitive sharks, and invertebrates. The 2007 modelling specifically highlighted armoured prey and ammonoids as plausible targets. The 2025 reassessment points toward bigger bites of flesh and substantial oral processing. Put together, that suggests a hunter willing to tackle a range of prey types so long as the returns justified the effort. It was not necessarily a shell specialist in the narrowest sense, nor merely a fish slicer. It was something broader and more useful than that. A predator whose bite gave it access to prey many other hunters would have found expensive, awkward, or simply not worth the trouble. There is also a quiet confidence in a predator that invests this much in the mouth. Some animals spread their risk across claws, speed, venom, stealth, or social hunting. Dunkleosteus seems to have put a very large portion of its case in the front of the skull. That does not mean it lacked swimming ability or ecological intelligence, only that the decisive moment of the hunt was likely meant to happen right there, between those blades. Once the prey was within reach, the physics could take over. It is a very old kind of confidence, and a very vertebrate one. Jaws changed the history of animal life by allowing organisms not just to filter or rasp or suck, but to seize, cut, and process with intention. Dunkleosteus represents one of the earliest times vertebrates took that freedom and pushed it toward truly intimidating proportions. The more you sit with that, the more the Devonian sea itself starts to feel narrower. Not empty, not simple, but narrower in the sense that some problems suddenly have fewer good answers. Shells are helpful until they are not. Armour is helpful until it meets enough concentrated force. Bone is useful, right up until something begins treating it as just another texture in the meal. A sea with Dunkleosteus in it was not merely a sea with a big predator, it was a sea in which a very old assumption that hard parts make you safer had met one of its earlier serious rebuttals. That is a large ecological shift to carry around in one mouth, and yet the mouth seems to have carried it quite well. Once that bite closes in the imagination, another question naturally swims into view. A mouth this specialised and this forceful does not exist in a vacuum. It belongs to a hunter with habits, target choices, approach strategies, and a place in the wider marine order. Bone, shell, and armour tell us what the bite could handle. They do not yet tell us how the animal used that ability day after day in the open Devonian sea, moving among reefs, fish schools, sharks, and other armoured bodies. That is where the fish stops being just a jaw and becomes a predator in full, which is exactly the direction the water is pulling us next. A mouth like that does not belong to a passive animal. It does not belong to something drifting politely through dim water, waiting for lunch to make a navigational error. However strange Dunkleosteus looks in stone, it was not built to be scenery. It was a hunter, and the more closely paleontologists study the rocks around it, the more that hunting life comes into focus. Not perfectly, because the Devonian does not hand us a complete body, a complete behaviour manual, and a courteous little diagram labelled daily routine. But it gives enough. It gives the setting, it gives the mechanics, it gives the company this animal kept, and when those pieces are placed together, Dunkleosteus begins to move in the mind not as a fossil display, but as a working predator in a very busy sea. The first thing to let go of is the old image of Dunkleosteus as a plodding armoured brute nosing around the seafloor like an irritated bulldozer with fins. That picture had a certain charm, in the same way that old museum murals of swamp-dwelling dinosaurs had a certain charm, but the evidence has been steadily pushing in another direction. Robert Carr's work on the paleoecology of Dunkleosteus argued that it was a free-swimming species living within the Appalachian Basin, not an obligate bottom liver whose remains had drifted in from elsewhere. More recent reconstruction work has reinforced that reading, describing the Cleveland Shale as an offshore setting with an oxygenated surface layer over a diaerobic to anoxic bottom, and noting that the fish fauna is strongly pelagic and nectonic. In plain language, Dunkleosteus was not a seafloor ambler. It belonged up in the water column, where the real traffic was. That matters because the kind of hunter an animal becomes depends very heavily on where it lives. A bottom dweller hunts differently from an open water predator. A reef lurker differs from a cruiser. A fish living over an anoxic basin floor with little benthic life available is not going to solve its meals by rummaging through the mud like a giant armoured vacuum cleaner. The paleo environment of the Cleveland Shale strongly suggests a layered sea in which the deeper bottom waters were hostile to benthic and demersal organisms, while the upper water column remained habitable for active swimmers. That places Dunkleosteus in a world of moving targets, changing light, suspended prey, and competitors that were also very much alive to opportunity. It hunted where things swam, not where they sat, and there was plenty swimming. The Cleveland Shale fauna contains more than 65 fish species, with large numbers of arthrodires and chondrichthyans. That alone is a useful corrective to the lonely monster image. Dunkleosteus was not the only noteworthy animal in its sea. It was one predator among many predators, and it shared its world with the early sharks, other armoured fishes, ray-finned fishes, and at least one sarcopterygian in this fauna. The water around it would not have felt empty. It would have felt crowded, competitive, and full of movement. The kind of place where being large and dangerous helped, but where being merely large and dangerous was probably not enough. A hunter in such a setting needed control. It needed timing. It needed a way to close the distance before the opportunity was gone. That is where the body starts to matter again. Recent reconstruction work argues that Dunkleosteus was probably shorter, deeper-bodied, and more stockily powerful than the older, elongated shark-like restoration suggested. At the same time, that same work points toward a fish adapted for active nectonic life, with a body form most plausibly compared to thunniform swimmers rather than to sluggish generalists. The idea is not that Dunkleosteus was literally a Devonian tuna in armour, which would be an unhelpfully silly way to put it, but that its body likely emphasised a relatively stiff front end, strong trunk musculature, and swimming driven more by the rear body and tail than by full body undulation. That is a very different animal from the old lumbering caricature. It begins to look like something that could accelerate with purpose. The tail is part of that story, even though the full tail has not been found attached in a complete Dunkleosteus body. Ferron and colleagues argued in 2017 that the caudal fin was likely reconstructed incorrectly in the old tradition, and proposed instead a tail with a well-developed ventral lobe, a narrow peduncle and a wide span. Later reconstruction work likewise describes the animal as consistent with a generally thunniform body shape, and emphasises features such as a stiffened anterior vertebral column, expanded attachment sites for the horizontal septum, and large areas for lateral trunk musculature. These are not the signs of a fish that simply loafed around waiting for prey to wander by. They are the sorts of clues that suggest a predator built to move decisively through open water. Even better, the newer reconstruction does not paint Dunkleosteus as a simple endurance machine. In fact, one of the more interesting conclusions is that, compared with modern tuna-like or lamnid-type swimmers, it may have traded some sustained speed for better manoeuvrability and burst acceleration. Engelmann's 2024 reconstruction notes that its deeper body, larger frontal profile, unusual pectoral fin placement, and broader overall form would likely have increased drag compared with a white shark or a tuna, but also may have improved turning and short-range performance. So, if you're looking for a mental image, think less of a long-distance marathon pursuit specialist and more of a powerful sprinter with a strong turning game and an extremely discouraging face. In a crowded upper water column, that is a very believable hunting package. That kind of swimmer makes a particular sort of ecological sense. Open water predators do not all hunt the same way. Some cover huge distances and wear prey down. Some rely on sudden approach and fast commitment once the target is within range. Some use manoeuvrability to exploit brief openings in schools or to seize prey before it can turn away. Dunkleosteus, with its stiffened forebody, large steering fins, heavy armour at the front and short-range mouth mechanics, looks well suited to that second and third style. It does not need to be the fastest animal over 100 kilometres. It only needs to be fast enough in the right moment to get the jaws where they need to be. Once the jaws arrive, the rest of the conversation becomes very short indeed, and there is no shortage of likely targets. The classic bite force study argued that Dunkleosteus was well equipped to puncture cuticle and dermal armour, making armoured placoderms and ammonoids plausible prey. The Ohio Geological Survey says much the same in more public-facing language, noting that its jaws could likely pierce the armour of other placoderms and the shells of ammonoid cephalopods. That means the hunter of the ancient oceans was not restricted to soft-bodied convenience food. It could plausibly exploit prey that came with defences, which opens up a wider menu and explains part of its ecological success. In a system with many armoured or shelled organisms, a predator capable of bypassing those defences is not simply another carnivore. It is a level above inconvenience. The evidence also points toward prey that was not especially slow. Ferron and colleagues noted that teeth of the fast-swimming shark-like fish, Orodus, have been found associated with Dunkleosteus remains, and interpreted as putative stomach contents. That is not proof that every Dunkleosteus was routinely zipping about the sea like a silver missile, and it is always wise to be a little cautious with isolated stomach content inferences. Still, it is a strong clue that this predator could capture active nectonic prey, not just armoured lumberers or injured animals drifting an easy reach. A hunter capable of taking fast pelagic fish is one that belongs firmly in the water column game, not at the margins of it. This is one of those points where the sea around the animal becomes easier to picture. You can imagine smaller fishes moving through the upper waters, some schooling, some cruising singly, some trying to remain forgettable. You can imagine primitive sharks making their own calculations about angle and distance. You can imagine ammonoids and other hard-shelled prey not exactly relaxing, but at least relying on the basic hope that a shell remains a useful argument. Then there is Dunkleosteus. Not necessarily the fastest thing for endless travel, not necessarily the most elegant in silhouette, but absolutely one of the clearest expressions of decisive force in that ecosystem. When it turns towards something, the turn matters. When it accelerates, the intention is obvious. When it reaches striking distance, whatever had seemed manageable a second earlier becomes very much less so. That is the sort of predator a sea remembers, even if the memory survives only as bone. It is also worth remembering that Dunkleosteus probably did not spend its life hunting in a single fixed style. Real predators are opportunists within limits. A body built for active swimming does not forbid ambush. A mouth built for hard prey does not prevent taking easier prey when available. A large hunter in a species-rich marine setting would very likely have taken what it could catch profitably. That probably meant different targets at different sizes and perhaps different microhabitats at different life stages. Popular summaries of the fossil evidence have suggested that smaller individuals may have handled softer-bodied prey, while adults were more capable of tackling heavily defended animals. The exact menu may remain uncertain, but the general principle is sensible. As predators grow, the world of edible things becomes broader, and Dunkleosteus appears to have widened that world very effectively. The upper waters of the Cleveland Shale Sea also may have encouraged a certain kind of caution and aggression at once. When the lower basin is oxygen poor and the productive life is concentrated above, predators and prey are compressed into the same habitable layer. That can intensify encounters. There is less point in lingering near the bottom if the bottom is a hostile place. There is less room, in ecological terms, for a hunter to disappear into a completely separate feeding zone. Dunkleosteus likely operated in this upper realm among other active animals, which may help explain why its morphology puts such emphasis on handling encounters quickly. In a crowded water column, hesitation is expensive. A hunter that can seize, cut, and process in short order is a hunter suited to traffic. There is also a roughness to ancient marine life that we should not tidy away. Predators did not merely hunt prey species in neat textbook categories. They competed. They scavenged when useful. They may have attacked rivals. Carr's paleoecology paper suggested that disarticulation in Dunkleosteus remains may partly reflect post-mortem flotation and possible scavenging within the water column. Research snippets and public paleontology profiles also indicate that bite damage on some Dunkleosteus material has been investigated as possible evidence of intraspecific aggression and perhaps even cannibalism, though those interpretations should be treated with care. The main point is not that every Dunkleosteus was out there chewing on its relatives like a badly behaved dinner guest. The point is that apex predation in a stressed offshore system is rarely tidy. The hunter of ancient oceans lived in a world where meat was meat, opportunities mattered, and rivals were sometimes only one bad encounter away from becoming data. That broader ecological role is what makes Dunkleosteus more than just a famous bite. Among the earliest large vertebrate apex predators, it occupies a special place because it shows how early jawed vertebrates could dominate marine systems not simply by growing bigger, but by integrating habitat, locomotion, and feeding power into a coherent hunting strategy. It was pelagic enough to live in the active upper water column. It was manoeuvrable enough, or at least forceful enough in bursts to function there effectively. It was armed well enough to exploit prey with serious defences, and it existed in a fauna rich enough to prove that this was not domination by default. It had competitors, it had alternatives around it. It still stands out. There is something oddly modern about that picture. Not modern in appearance, because nothing about Dunkleosteus looks remotely polite enough to pass as a current fish, but modern in ecological role. We recognise the pattern: offshore predator, active swimmer, broad prey range, strong attack hardware, trade-off between sustained efficiency and short-range authority. Even the hints of possible scavenging or opportunism fit. It reminds you that the sea worked out certain truths a very long time ago. If food moves in the open water, successful hunters tend to become hydrodynamic enough to reach it, and forceful enough to matter once they do. Dunkleosteus arrived at that solution through an entirely extinct vertebrate design path, but the underlying logic is familiar. The ocean does not care whether your blueprint later leaves descendants. It cares whether it works today. And yet, even with all this, there is still a shadow around the animal, because for something so iconic, so often painted and mounted and declared terrifying in educational gift shops across the world, Dunkleosteus remains strangely unfinished. The skull is famous. The jaws are famous. The life habit is much clearer now than it used to be. But the complete outline of the body, the exact proportions, the true sense of scale, those are still things science has had to keep revising. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is part of what keeps the animal alive in paleontology. The hunter is visible enough to be impressive and incomplete enough to be argued over, which is a very durable combination. Once you begin watching it move through the ancient ocean in your mind, the next thought comes almost automatically. Fine, it hunted like this. Fine, it occupied this role. But exactly how much fish are we really talking about here when the whole animal is allowed back into the room? Size is one of those things prehistory loves to exaggerate, and Dunkleosteus has suffered from that affection more than most. For decades, it was often presented as a colossal armoured fish, stretching out to 6, 8, even 10 metres in length, the sort of animal that sounds less like a real vertebrate and more like something assembled by a child who has been given too much freedom with a museum gift card. Those older giant estimates became famous because they were memorable, and because once a prehistoric animal has been introduced to the world as enormous, it is very difficult to politely ask it to become smaller again. But that is exactly what newer research has done. The current picture is not of a tiny Dunkleosteus, not by any reasonable standard, but of a shorter, deeper, stockier predator than the old legend suggested. The fish did not shrink into irrelevance. It simply stopped pretending to be a bus. Part of the confusion comes from the fossils themselves. Dunkleosteus is famous, yes, but fame and completeness are not the same thing. What usually preserves best are the armoured head and thoracic plates at the front of the body. The softer or more cartilaginous rear portions are much less commonly preserved, and the Cleveland Museum notes plainly that while the skull bones preserve well, the body did not, and that no complete Dunkleosteus body has yet been found. That means paleontologists have had to estimate total body length from the front end, which is rather like being handed only the grille and dashboard of a vehicle and being asked to determine whether it was a hatchback, a van, or a very overconfident limousine. You can do it, but you had better do it carefully. For a long time, researchers and artists filled in that missing body using comparisons that now look increasingly doubtful. The result was a fossil fish that became famous partly because the unknown parts had been stretched into something spectacular. That older tradition did not arise from laziness. It came from a real problem. If most of what you have is the front half, you need some way to estimate the rest. Earlier reconstructions often leaned on comparisons with sharks, or with smaller, more completely known arthrodires, and those comparisons were not always unreasonable at the time. The difficulty is that Dunkleosteus turns out to have had a body plan that does not map neatly onto either of those shortcuts. Its mouth is proportionally very large, its trunk armour is unusually deep, and its overall build seems to have been more compact than the long-bodied shark-like restorations implied. Newer work has therefore pushed back against those older size estimates, not because paleontologists suddenly became joyless, but because the geometry of the animal itself kept refusing to cooperate with the old fantasy. The more closely researchers looked at complete mounted armour, comparative anatomy, and proportional constraints across arthrodires and fishes more generally, the less plausible the stretched-out giant became. One of the clearest turning points came in 2023, when Russell Engelman tested the widely cited shark-based method that had produced body lengths of roughly 5.3 to 8.8 metres for Dunkleosteus. That study argued that using the oral dimensions of modern sharks to estimate Dunkleosteus size does not work reliably, because arthrodires have proportionally larger mouths for their body length than sharks do. Put simply, a very large mouth in a shark and a very large mouth in an arthrodire do not mean the same thing. The method had been overestimating the fish because it assumed a modern shark-like relationship between mouth size and total length that Dunkleosteus simply did not share. This is one of those findings that sounds dry until you realise what it means. A great many of the biggest published Dunkleosteus sizes were not built on solid ground to begin with. They were impressive numbers standing on the wrong ruler. Engelman's 2023 and 2024 work then moved toward a different picture. In the 2024 Reconstruction paper, drawing on earlier size work, he reports body lengths of about 3.0 to 3.4 metres for subadults to typical adults of Dunkleosteus torelli, with the largest individuals estimated at around 4.1 metres. He also notes that margins of error leave some room for larger individuals, with values as high as about 3.8 metres for average adults and 4.5 metres for maximum adults still possible, but that lengths much beyond that are unlikely. Even more striking is the proportional argument that accompanies those numbers. Historical giant estimates would require Dunkleosteus to have had a head only about 8% of total length, whereas most non-anguilliform fishes, including other arthrodires, have heads in the 18 to 30% range. In other words, if the old 6 to 10 metre versions were correct, Dunkleosteus would have needed to carry a strangely tiny head behind all that famous armour, which the actual fossils do not support. That is a wonderfully practical way for a hypothesis to fail. The fish was not too small for the old stories. The old stories were too long for the fish's face. This does not mean every large Dunkleosteus you've ever seen in a museum mural was pure invention. There really were some bigger individuals. The 2024 paper notes that the large adult specimen CNH5768 sits in the upper 5th percentile of a hyperdiem of more than 600 specimens, and that a few larger individuals, up to about 20 to 25% larger in linear dimensions, do exist. The same paper suggests those rarer specimens are probably close to the maximum size achieved by D. torelli in the Cleveland Shale. That is important because it keeps the story honest. The revised Dunkleosteus is not a toy version. Typical adults around 3.4 metres and exceptionally large individuals around 4.1 metres still make for a substantial, heavily armoured predator, especially one built as densely and aggressively as this one appears to have been. 4 metres of compact, bladed, armoured fish is not disappointing unless one has become emotionally dependent on the idea of aquatic buses. In more familiar terms, the newer estimate puts a large Dunkleosteus at around 14 feet, rather than the older 20-plus or 30-foot claims. That aligns with the 2025 Case Western and FIS.org coverage of the new anatomical work, which describes it as a 14-foot armoured fish, and with the Cleveland Museum's public explanation that published size estimates have ranged from about 3 to 10 metres precisely, because the body remains unknown and has been repeatedly reconstructed in different ways. So there is a useful distinction to hold on to here. The range of estimates in the literature and in public discussion is genuinely broad, but the best supported current estimates are clustered much lower than the biggest historical claims. A person can still say that Dunkleosteus was large without quietly sneaking in dimensions that no longer fit the anatomy. What makes the revised size especially persuasive is that it does not stand alone. It is reinforced by body shape. The 2024 reconstruction argues that Dunkleosteus had a relatively deep trunk, with the trunk itself reaching about 25 to 28% of total length in subadult to adult individuals, and that this deep-bodied shape is supported by the proportions of the preserved armour. The paper repeatedly emphasises that the trunk armour is unusually deep among arthrodires. That matters because a shorter animal with a deep, stocky trunk is exactly what the preserved front half suggests. A gigantic, very elongated body, by contrast, would make the known anatomy look oddly front-heavy and proportionally awkward. Once you stop picturing a stretched shark and start picturing a broad, deep, compact pelagic predator, the smaller length estimates stop feeling like reductions and start feeling like corrections. The animal becomes less long and more serious. There is a curious psychological effect in all this. Many people hear that Dunkleosteus may have been 4 meters rather than 8, and imagine that the animal has somehow become less impressive, as if half the length must mean half the menace. But predators are not judged by tape measure alone. Body proportions matter, function matters, density matters. A shorter fish with a deeper trunk, a stiffened armoured front, a broad gape, and a mouth designed for cutting and processing resistant prey can feel more formidable than a longer but vaguer creature. The revised Dunkleosteus is not merely smaller, it is more coherent. It looks like a real animal built around force and manoeuvrability rather than an oversized story built around a number. This is one of those rare cases where trimming an icon down actually makes it sharper. There is also a larger paleontological lesson hiding in this size debate, and it is a useful one. Famous prehistoric measurements are often surprisingly fragile. Once an estimate enters books, museum signage, children's magazines, and online fact lists, it gains a kind of social momentum. It becomes the size, even if the original method was unclear, untested, or only loosely justified. Dunkleosteus is a very good example. The 2024 reconstruction notes that traditionally proposed lengths of 5 to 10 meters cannot be justified by the currently available anatomical evidence, and goes so far as to say there is no evidence for any arthrodire exceeding roughly 4.5 meters. That is not merely a tweak, it is a reminder that paleontology is full of inherited assumptions, and some of them last far longer than they deserve. The fossil itself has not changed. Our willingness to question the old rulers has. Another reason the newer estimates carry weight is that they are tied to actual specimens rather than to generalized awe. The reconstruction uses the Cleveland Museum's mounted individuals and discusses them as an ontogenetic series from juveniles to large, likely mature adults. C-NH 5768 is treated as representative of a large adult, while a handful of other specimens provide the upper end. This specimen-based approach is much healthier than older habits of repeating giant numbers without clearly stating which specimen they came from or how. The revised picture is not just Dunkleosteus was smaller now. It is, here are the individuals, here are their proportions, here is the head-to-body logic, and here is why the giant versions no longer add up. That kind of reasoning may be less dramatic than simply announcing a 12-meter monster, but it has the enormous advantage of being attached to anatomy instead of nostalgia. The head itself is a large part of why the older image lingered so long. Dunkleosteus has such an oversized visual presence at the front that the brain almost wants to assign it a correspondingly gigantic rear half. Surely a face like that must belong to a creature of absurd total length, but proportion does not always obey our instincts. Some animals are imposing because they are long, others are imposing because they are front-loaded. Dunkleosteus appears to belong firmly in the second group. The 2024 papers point that historical estimates require a head only around 8% of total length is especially helpful here, because it reveals the quiet absurdity hidden inside the old giants. A fish with this famous A-head should not end up looking like a ribbon trailing away behind it. The front of the animal was telling us all along that the back was probably not as long as we had been drawing it. We simply took a while to listen, and yet the story is not one of total certainty. The same newer work that argues for a shorter, deeper Dunkleosteus also admits margins of error and leaves some room at the upper end. That is as it should be. Paleontology is not an exact measurement game when the rear half of the fish remains incompletely known. A maximum around 4.1 meters seems best supported, with perhaps something like 4.5 meters remaining within plausible error, but the literature does not present a sealed case where every sane person must now agree on the same final decimal place. There is still wiggle room. The important thing is where that wiggle room is located. It sits around the low to mid 4 metre range, not in the old realm of 6, 8 or 10 metres. The disagreement now is over how chunky the monster was, not whether it secretly qualified as public transport. There is something almost endearing in the way Dunkleosteus has handled this reputational downsizing. Plenty of extinct celebrities would suffer badly from a reduction like that. A giant snake shortened by half loses some of its magic. A towering sauropod trimmed to family car proportions would be an entirely different emotional experience. Dunkleosteus, however, remains stubbornly impressive because its appeal never depended on length alone. It depended on armour, it depended on jaws, it depended on that concentrated, overbuilt, highly specific sense of danger. The fish can lose several metres and still keep all of that. In fact, the shorter, thicker reconstruction may intensify the effect. Instead of a long, unknown body trailing off into artistic optimism, the newer Dunkleosteus feels packed, loaded and deliberate. The menace is no longer diluted by too much tail. So how big was Dunkleosteus really? The best current answer is large, but not ludicrous. Typical adults seem to have been around 3.0 to 3.4 metres long, with the biggest known individuals around 4.1 metres, and perhaps somewhat more within error, though not by very much. The famous 6 to 10 metre figures are now widely treated as overestimates that conflict with body proportions, comparative anatomy, and newer methods for estimating length in arthrodires. That revised answer may be less convenient for old posters, but it gives us something better than convenience. It gives us a more believable animal. It gives us a predator whose size finally matches the evidence rather than the legend, and whose legend, rather annoyingly for every prey species in the Devonian, turns out to survive the correction just fine. Once the measurements are brought back under control, another part of the picture becomes easier to consider calmly. Not simply how much Dunkleosteus there was, but how that body fit into the rest of the sea around it, and what in that sea might still have posed a problem for something built this well. An ancient ocean does not hand out safety evenly. Some creatures are born into a world where almost everything seems to want a bite of them, and some grow large enough, hard enough, or unpleasant enough that the list of enemies begins to shrink. Dunkleosteus appears to have spent much of its life moving steadily from the first category toward the second. By adulthood, it was a pelagic apex predator in the Cleveland Shale Sea, living up in the water column rather than skulking along the bottom, and its anatomy points to a hunter equipped for large, resistant prey. That already tells us something important. A fish like this did not sit at the top of the Devonian food web because it was decorative. It sat there because it could eat things that many other predators would have found too armoured, too fast, too awkward, or simply too argumentative. So what did it eat? The most cautious answer is also the most persuasive one. A broad menu of other animals living in those upper waters, especially vertebrates and shelled invertebrates that could be seized, cut, and processed by its bony jaw blades. The Ohio Geological Survey says its prey likely included other placoderms, bony fishes, primitive sharks, and invertebrates, while the classic bite force work argued specifically that Dunkleosteus could puncture cuticle and dermal armour, making heavily defended prey such as other placoderms and ammonoid cephalopods plausible targets. The 2025 anatomical update from Case Western pushes the same picture a bit further by suggesting that the bone blade specialisations of Dunkleosteus and its relatives reflect increasing adaptation for hunting other large fishes and biting chunks from big prey rather than simply swallowing small animals whole. Put all that together, and the portrait is not of a picky specialist with one favourite snack. It is of a predator whose mouth gave it access to a wide and rather inconveniently well-defended part of the ecosystem. That matters, because a Devonian prey animal could not assume that armour alone would settle the matter. Another placoderm might well have trusted its dermal plates to persuade most hunters to look elsewhere. An ammonoid might have trusted the shell. A primitive shark might have trusted speed, and a bony fish might have trusted some combination of mobility, distance, and luck. Dunkleosteus seems to have been built to challenge all four strategies. Its jaw edges could shear through resistant material, and its bite force was modelled as strong enough to pierce placoderm armour and hard ammonoid shells. That is a rather rude thing for evolution to do to a food web. It means the usual categories of comfort become less reliable. Shell is no longer certainty. Armour is no longer certainty. Even size stops being especially reassuring once a predator is adapted to taking chunks out of large fishes. The sea remains full of defences, but one of its most famous hunters appears to have regarded those defences as engineering problems. There is another clue to the menu that makes the whole animal feel more active and less hypothetical. A 2017 ecomorphology study notes that teeth of the shark-like fish, or Rhodus, were found associated with Dunkleosteus remains, and suggested these were probably stomach contents. The point is not that every Dunkleosteus spent its evenings neatly dining on oroders, but that at least some evidence fits the idea of prey that was itself a capable open water swimmer. That in turn supports the broader picture of Dunkleosteus as a pelagic hunter, not a slow-moving opportunist only capable of bullying the most cumbersome neighbours in the sea. A predator that can plausibly catch fast pelagic fish belongs to a more serious category of trouble. It is not merely dangerous if you happen to drift into it. It is dangerous because it can come find you, and yet it would be a mistake to imagine Dunkleosteus as some sort of underwater aristocrat, too refined to bother with easier meals. Real predators are rarely so proud. If a hunter can take armoured placoderms and ammonoids, it can also take smaller, softer, less difficult prey whenever those are available and worth the effort. The geological summary from Ohio is almost refreshingly plain about this, naming invertebrates alongside fishes and sharks in its likely prey list. That broad wording fits what one would expect from a large marine apex predator in a species-rich offshore setting. It probably did not pass up a good meal simply because the victim lacked a shell dramatic enough to make the papers. The mouth was built for hard jobs, but that does not mean it needed every job to be hard. Some days, one imagines, even an armoured giant appreciates convenience. There's a practical side to this too. Catching prey is only half the problem. Once a large fish has hold of another substantial animal, it still has to turn that catch into swallowable pieces. The newer 2025 work argues that Dunkleosteus may have been less of a classic suction feeder than older models proposed and more of a wide-gape ram-feeding biter that orally processed prey, biting chunks from large fishes. That does not erase the earlier biomechanical work so much as refine the moment after capture. In one version, the mouth opens quickly, pressure changes help draw prey in, and the jaws close with alarming force. In the updated version, the fish may have depended more on a large gape and strong slicing mechanics to take apart prey too large or too resistant to gulp down in one neat go. Either way, the food does not remain intact for long. Dunkleosteus looks increasingly like a predator that solved the problem of large meals by making them smaller in a decidedly unfriendly way. This is where the first half of the title begins to answer itself. What it ate was, in essence, whatever the upper Devonian sea could provide that was worth the chase, and vulnerable to a mouth like that. Other armoured fishes, bony fishes, primitive sharks, hard-shelled cephalopods, probably a range of invertebrates when available. Possibly at times prey large enough that a single attack did not end in one swallow, but in a sequence of cuts and processing bites. There is no need to decorate that picture much further. The fossils have already done the decorating. Once you know the prey likely included armour, bone and shell, the sea around Dunkleosteus stops feeling like a generic ancient ocean and starts feeling like a pantry full of locked containers. Dunkleosteus was the creature that brought its own opener. Now comes the more interesting part, because top predators do not merely eat, they are also watched. A large hunter changes the emotional climate of its world. It is difficult to fossilise fear, of course. No shale layer arrives helpfully labelled general anxiety among medium-sized placoderms. But ecosystems do leave us enough clues to make reasonable inferences. If Dunkleosteus was an apex predator cruising the oxygenated surface waters of the late Devonian Sea, and if its likely prey included other placoderms, bony fishes, primitive sharks and invertebrates, then a very large portion of that upper water community probably had practical reasons to avoid it, not because every organism was on the menu every day, but because an animal with that mouth and that roll narrowed the margin for error. School too slowly, turn too late, wander injured, grow to the wrong size class, or trust your shell a little too much, and suddenly the local food web becomes extremely personal. In that sense, what feared Dunkleosteus was not just a list of species, it was a zone of vulnerability. Smaller and medium-sized pelagic fishes likely had reason to fear it. Other armoured placoderms likely had reason to fear it. Primitive sharks sharing those same waters likely had reason to fear it. Ammonoids and similar shelled prey had reason to fear it even if their shells had worked reasonably well against less specialised predators. The Cleveland member fauna was rich, with 66 fish species documented in Carr's study alone, including 33 sharks, 28 placoderms and 5 osteichthyons, and Dunkleosteus lived among them as one of the most formidable vertebrate predators in that assemblage. A sea this busy does not revolve around one fish, but one fish can still make a noticeable impression on everyone else's planning. There is a tendency, when talking about apex predators, to imagine them as solitary terrors everyone else simply flees on sight. Nature is usually less theatrical. More often, prey live under a constant statistical pressure rather than in a permanent state of melodramatic panic. Dunkleosteus probably did not cause every fish within 20 metres to faint elegantly into the current. But it did occupy a position in the ecosystem where its presence had consequences. Schools may have tightened. Smaller prey may have favoured cover, distance, or numbers when possible. Armoured prey may still have depended on their protection, but with less confidence than they would have felt in a sea without a chunk-biting placoderm at the top. Fear in an ecosystem is often just geometry plus experience. If enough bodies disappear when the big armoured one turns up, the rest of the sea begins making quieter choices. But then there is the second half of the title, and this part requires more honesty, because the fossils are much less chatty here. What did Dunkleosteus fear? For fully grown adults, no clearly documented routine predator species stands out in the evidence we have been looking at. Carr's paleoecology paper treats Dunkleosteus as a pelagic apex predator, and the broader anatomical and biomechanical work supports that high trophic role. The sources do not point to some larger, even nastier animal regularly hunting adult Dunkleosteus in those same waters. That does not mean such interactions were impossible. It means they are not securely documented in the evidence at hand. A healthy adult Dunkleosteus seems to have lived near the top, which is a pleasant place to be right up until you realise that the remaining dangers are often bigger, messier, and less polite than ordinary predation. One of those dangers may very well have been other Dunkleosteus. Here we have to be careful, because the much circulated cannibalism claim rests on limited evidence, including a 2016 conference abstract reporting possible cannibalism based on bite damage, not on a complete peer-reviewed monograph announcing the case closed. Even so, the idea is not frivolous. The abstract exists, later public summaries repeat it, and specimen-level damage interpreted as punctures or scrape marks from another Dunkleosteus has become part of the ongoing discussion around the genus. The safest way to say it is this: there is suggestive, not definitive, evidence that Dunkleosteus sometimes bit other large placoderms, including perhaps its own kind. Whether those encounters were outright cannibalism, territorial combat, opportunistic feeding, or some unhappy combination of all three remains uncertain. But if you're asking what a giant Devonian apex predator may have feared in life, another giant Devonian apex predator with the same mouth is a very respectable answer. That possibility also fits the general mood of large predator biology rather well. The closer you get to the top of a food web, the less your troubles come from being hunted by some clearly superior beast, and the more they come from rivalry, injury, and risk. A wound from a conspecific is not just a dramatic story, it is an ecological cost. Large biting predators often live in worlds where serious injury can be as dangerous as being eaten outright. Even if a fight ends with both parties swimming away, one may do so carrying a damaged jaw or edge, a compromised plate, or an infection waiting to become someone else's advantage. Fossils are frustratingly selective about preserving those details, but the principle is old and dependable. Near the top, fear often stops being about being prey and becomes more about being replaceable. There is another thing Dunkleosteus may have feared, or at least needed to navigate carefully, and that was the sea itself. The Cleveland Shale environment was not a uniformly friendly body of water. It was an offshore setting with an oxygenated surface layer over a diaerobic to anoxic bottom, and in some areas that anoxic zone may have stretched across a very broad swathe of basin. Benthic and demersal life was sparse to nearly absent there, and remains often sank from the habitable upper waters into a deeper zone that was effectively off-limits to most large living fishes. That means Dunkleosteus inhabited a sea with vertical constraints. The comfortable parts of the world were stacked above uncomfortable parts of the world, and much of life was compressed into the layers where oxygen remained available. A hunter can dominate a habitat and still depend on it absolutely. If the upper waters narrowed, shifted, or failed, even the hunter in charge would have felt the change. That environmental pressure matters because it changes how we think about fear. For some animals, fear is a face in the dark. For others, it is chemistry. It is water that can no longer be used. It is prey that no longer appears in the same numbers. It is a habitat that slowly stops forgiving mistakes. Carr's study notes that disarticulated Dunkleosteus remains likely reflect post-mortem flotation and possible scavenging within the water column, while the Cleveland Shale's preservational conditions indicate a sea where falling into the wrong layer after death had very different consequences from what happened while alive. There is something almost practical about that. Dunkleosteus may have had few serious enemies as an adult, but once dead or dying, the sea wasted no time changing categories. Apex status is a living privilege. Carcasses enter a different system. And then, above all of that, there was the larger danger no predator can bite its way out of: time. The Ohio Geological Survey notes that Dunkleosteus, along with the remaining placoderms, disappeared by the end of the Devonian, about 359 million years ago. However formidable it was in the local hierarchy of the late Devonian Sea, it did not survive the larger biological upheavals that closed that era. This is one of the quiet truths hidden inside all apex predator stories. Becoming the thing everyone else fears does not protect you from environmental change, extinction pulses, or the slow rearrangement of the planet's living systems. A creature can rule its sea very effectively and still lose the century, or in this case, the geological period. There is a kind of humility in that, though I doubt Dunkleosteus would have appreciated the lesson while alive. So what did it eat? What did it fear? And what feared it? It ate broadly and brutally within the limits of its ecosystem. Other armoured fishes, bony fishes, primitive sharks, invertebrates, and likely shelled cephalopods, with anatomy suited for taking on large and resistant prey. It was feared by much of the upper water community because it was one of the earliest vertebrate predators to combine pelagic hunting, chunk-taking jaws, and the ability to ignore many of the usual defensive strategies. And what it feared, if one can use the word gently, was probably not some single, regular super predator waiting in the wings, but a smaller and more intimate set of dangers, rivals of its own kind, injury, habitat limits, and the sort of planetary bad luck that eventually swallows entire dynasties. Once you see the fish that way, it becomes more than a museum monster. It becomes an animal living under the same old rules as every other hunter, only with better equipment than most, and with a sea around it that was just unstable enough to remind even the strongest bite in the basin that strength is not the same thing as permanence. There is a small disappointment built into nearly every famous fossil. You hear the name, you imagine a complete skeleton rising cleanly out of the rock, every fin and plate and curve of the body waiting patiently for a scientist to dust it off and say, "There we are, mystery solved." Dunkleosteus does not behave that way. What we have, most of the time, is the armoured front end, the part most willing to survive, while the rest of the animal has spent 360 million years being far less cooperative. That is what makes reconstructing Dunkleosteus both difficult and oddly intimate. Paleontologists are not simply naming bones. They're trying to rebuild a predator from the pieces most likely to persist and the pieces most likely to go missing. The result is not guesswork in the careless sense, but a patient exercise in limits, comparison, and humility. The monster is real. The monster is also incomplete. The rocks themselves explain part of the problem. The Cleveland Shale began as mud on an ancient seafloor, accumulating in a late Devonian basin where dead animals sank, settled, and were covered by fine sediments that eventually hardened into black shale. Those conditions were excellent for preserving certain hard parts, especially the armoured bones of placoderm heads and thoracic shields. They were much less generous to anything soft or largely cartilaginous. The Cleveland Museum notes that Dunkleosteus skull bones preserved well, while its body did not, and the newer Case Western work adds an especially useful detail. Arthrodire bodies were mostly made of cartilage, and even much of the skull included major cartilaginous components. So from the very beginning, the fossil record stacked the deck. It kept the face, it kept the armour, it kept enough to make the animal famous, and withheld enough to keep people arguing for the next century and a half. That story starts, in a public sense, in 1867 along the Lake Erie cliffs near Sheffield Lake, where J. Terrell found the first Dunkleosteus fossils. The Ohio Geological Survey traces the original description to John Strong Newberry in 1873, when the material was first named Dynasty terrelli, with the species name honouring Terrell. Later work would shift the better-known Cleveland Shale material into the genus Dunkleosteus, combining the name of paleontologist David Dunkel with the Greek word for bone. There is something very fitting about that lineage of names. The fish enters science through a local collector, a state geologist, and later museum paleontologists, which is exactly how many great fossil stories begin. Not with a neat cinematic reveal, but with people walking exposed rock and recognising that a strange piece of bone is not ordinary stone after all. Once the first discoveries were made, the real work began, and this is where Dunkleosteus becomes less a fossil and more a long-running local obsession. In the 1920s, professionals from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, including Peter Bungart, added new material from northern Ohio. The Ohio Geological Survey notes that some fossils were trapped inside hard concretions and had to be extracted and meticulously reassembled. Cleveland Historical gives the process an even more physical feel. In 1928, Bungart and Jesse Earl Hyde excavated a major specimen from the Rocky River Reservation, cut it out of the cliff in roughly 300-pound chunks, brought it back to the museum, and then spent years preparing it. Bungart reportedly chipped away at the stone for nearly 8 years, using a dental drill, hammer, chisel, and even a blowtorch. That is one of the least glamorous and most reassuring facts in paleontology. Behind every famous prehistoric monster is usually someone in a basement making very slow progress with unpleasant tools, and even after all that labour, the fossils still refuse to make things easy. Carr's work on the Cleveland Shale material notes that Dunkleosteus remains are typically disarticulated and incomplete, with only about 5.1% of evaluated specimens preserving more than 25% of the dermal and perichondral bones. That is a startlingly small number when you think about how world famous this animal is, Most of the monster exists in our minds because the actual monster usually arrives scattered. Carr argued that this disarticulation likely reflects post-mortem flotation and possible scavenging in the water column rather than transport from some distant habitat. In other words, the fish likely lived in that basin, died there, and then came apart before burial in a sea that was not especially sentimental about complete preservation. That makes each mounted skull and armour assembly feel less like a single fossil and more like a solved accident scene. This is why the front half of Dunkleosteus has always dominated both science and the imagination. The armour survives because it is armour. The body disappears because cartilage is a terrible long-term publicist. The Cleveland Museum says no complete Dunkleosteus body has ever been found, and the 2025 Case Western report underscores how much hidden anatomy was originally cartilaginous, including nearly half the skull and many major jaw connections and muscle attachment sites. That means paleontologists have had to rebuild not only the rear body, but also some critical internal relationships of the skull itself. The famous bony plates are what you see in the display case, but they do not represent the full living structure. A mounted Dunkleosteus skull is therefore both honest and incomplete at the same time. It shows you the best preserved truth. It also quietly reminds you how much living fish was never invited to become stone. For decades, one reconstruction shaped almost everything people thought they knew about the animal. In 1931 and 1932, Erich Heinz published a formal reconstruction of Dunkleosteus armour that became the foundation for most later depictions. The remarkable thing is that the new 2024 reconstruction paper says this old model was never truly superseded, even though it differs in proportion from the well-preserved, three-dimensionally mounted Cleveland specimens and is missing several plates. The same paper adds a wonderful historical complication. Heinz knew the Cleveland material existed but deliberately avoided using it because Jesse Hyde was preparing monographs on the museum's collection, and Heinz did not want to scoop him. That is scholarly courtesy of a very high order, but it also meant that one of the most influential images of Dunkleosteus was built without fully using the best material available. For nearly a century, the monster's face was being introduced to the world through a reconstruction that was, in important ways, already incomplete. That old reconstruction was not useless. It was simply limited by its moment. Arthrodire anatomy in the early 20th century was not understood nearly as well as it is now, and much of the immediate work then was simply figuring out how the plates fit together at all. The recent Case Western summary says the last major detailed work on Dunkleosteus jaw anatomy, before the new study was published in 1932, when researchers were still mostly trying to reconstruct the bones, rather than read them for muscle attachments and function. That line is worth holding on to. At first, paleontology often works like carpentry. The first task is getting the pieces back onto the table in roughly the right places. Only later does the science become fine-grained enough to ask subtler questions. What cartilage sat between those plates? Which surfaces actually carried muscles? Which features are original and which were distorted by preservation? The monster has to be reassembled before it can be understood. Modern work has been able to do more because the Cleveland collection is simply so large. Engelmann's 2024 reconstruction was based on examination of near-complete, three-dimensionally mounted heads and thoracic armours at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, spanning juveniles, subadults, and large, likely mature adults. This same paper says the broader CMNH hypodyme includes more than 600 specimens, with a few exceptional individuals slightly larger than the museum's best-known mounted adult. That scale matters. A single spectacular fossil can make an animal famous. A large series of fossils lets scientists begin to see growth, variation, and proportion. It lets them ask whether one odd plate is a pathology, an age effect, a preservation quirk, or a genuine species-level feature. Piece by piece, the fish becomes less mythical and more statistical, which is a very useful way of making a monster behave. The collecting history helped build that sample in ways that are almost charmingly industrial. The Ohio Geological Survey notes that, beyond the early rivers and stream exposures, the mid-1960s expansion of Interstate 71 cut through the Cleveland Shale in Big Creek Valley. Under the supervision of William Lavin, the Cleveland Museum used a section of the Federal Highway Act to salvage paleontological material during road construction, building one of the world's premier collections of Dunkleosteus fossils and other late Devonian fishes. There is something wonderfully Ohio about that. A giant armoured fish from the Devonian becomes better understood partly because modern humans were trying to put in a highway. Paleontology often works this way. The planet gives up its old stories not only in deserts and remote cliffs, but in drainage cuts, stream banks and construction zones, where someone has the good sense to stop the machinery for a moment and call the museum. Even with all those fossils, though, reconstruction remains a discipline of constrained imagination. Engelmann's 2024 paper is very explicit about this. The post-Thoracic body is still poorly known, but its shape can be constrained by preserved elements and by conserved anatomical patterns seen across arthrodires and fishes more generally. That is a very paleontological sentence. It means we do not know everything, but we do know some things the missing parts would not have been allowed to do. The trunk armour is unusually deep. The pectoral fin base sits very far forward. The anterior trunk is stiffened by interlocking plates. Muscle attachment patterns imply a certain kind of powerful swimming body, so the missing body is not drawn out of thin air. It is rebuilt from the fossils that survive, from close relatives, from comparison with other fish bodies, and from the simple fact that living animals have to function. A plausible Dunkleosteus body is one that the armour, joints and muscles could actually have supported. The 2025 anatomical reassessment pushes that realism even further by restoring more cartilage to the skull and identifying jaw muscle arrangements that make Dunkleosteus look less like a neat old museum diagram and more like a genuinely complex vertebrate head. The study, as summarised by Case Weston, found that nearly half the skull was cartilaginous and described a large bony channel for a facial jaw muscle comparable to those in sharks and rays. It also stressed that Dunkleosteus was unusual even among arthrodires because most arthrodires had actual teeth, whereas Dunkleosteus and its close relatives had lost them in favour of the famous bone blades. That matters because it shows how reconstructions change. At first you are grateful to have the plates back together. Later you realise the spaces between the plates were where much of the story had been hiding. That is also why museum displays of Dunkleosteus are such interesting objects in themselves. They are part fossil, part inference, part historical tradition. The Cleveland Museum openly tells visitors that the skull bones are real, while the body remains unknown. The old museum and public models often showed a long shark-like animal, because that seemed like a reasonable way to extend an intimidating head into a full fish. The newer reconstruction work argues for a shorter, deeper, stockier, more thunniform body. So a mounted Dunkleosteus does not just show you one prehistoric predator, it shows you the current state of a conversation between stone, anatomy, and human restraint. Every time the model changes, paleontology is not ruining the monster. It is pulling the monster a little closer to the fish it actually was. There is something almost moving in that process. A person finds fragments in shale. Another person extracts them from a concretion. Another fits plates together. Another notices a missing plate in an old reconstruction. Another compares juveniles and adults. Another looks at muscle scars and cartilage. Another revises the jaw. Another shortens the body. Over generations, the same animal is built and rebuilt, not because science is confused, but because science is patient. Piecing together a monster from stone sounds dramatic, and it is, but the drama is not in sudden revelation. It is in stubborn accumulation. The fish becomes visible because many people, over many years, are willing to accept incomplete answers and then improve them anyway. That is a slower and better kind of spectacle than the monster itself. And perhaps that is the right place to leave the bones for now, not as a solved puzzle, but as a well-built one. We have the armour, we have the jaws, we have the history of discovery from Terrell's first finds along Lake Erie through Bungart's patient reconstructions and the later salvage work that turned Ohio road cuts into paleontological gold. We have old reconstructions that shaped a century of imagination and newer studies that are correcting them plate by plate and muscle by muscle. What we do not have even now is perfect closure. The fish still withholds part of itself. It still leaves scientists standing in front of stone trying to decide how much of the living body can be recovered from what the shale chose to keep. And once you have spent enough time watching that patient reconstruction unfold, another question starts to edge in quite naturally. If this animal had to be assembled so carefully from fragments, what does it mean that even such a successful predator eventually became one more broken thing in the rock, waiting for someone else to find it? Great predators have a way of making the world around them look stable. When one animal becomes the obvious terror in its part of the sea, we begin to imagine that its reign must have been long, secure, and somehow inevitable. Dunkleosteus encourages exactly that illusion. It looks finished. It looks as though it arrived in the Devonian already knowing what sort of face a top predator ought to wear. But the truth is less tidy and, in a way, more interesting. Dunkleosteus rose in a world already shaken by crisis, and it vanished in another. Its story is not one of uninterrupted dominance from the dawn of the Age of Fishes to the very end. It is the story of an animal that flourished during a narrow and turbulent stretch of late Devonian time, in seas already recovering from one major extinction pulse, and moving, perhaps without knowing it, toward another. That makes its success feel sharper. It did not rule a calm ocean. It ruled an ocean with a memory of disaster and a future full of it. To understand the rise, it helps to start a little earlier than the famous skulls in Ohio. Placoderms as a whole had already been among the dominant jawed vertebrates of the Devonian, and Arthrodires in particular had become impressively varied. Dunkleosteus belongs to that larger radiation, not as a lonely accident, but as one of its most formidable late expressions. The Ohio material itself hints at that longer story. Robert Carr's 2010 revision described 2 additional North American species of Dunkleosteus, and noted that Dunkleosteus reveri occurs stratigraphically below the other Ohio shale species, Dunkleosteus terrelli, within the Furmenian succession. That does not mean one can draw a simple tidy arrow and say this species turned into that species, without further evidence, but it does show that Dunkleosteus was not a one-off apparition that blinked into existence at the last possible moment. The genus had depth in time and presence across more than one late Devonian setting. By the time D. terrelli appears in the Cleveland member, the broader Dunkleosteus experiment was already underway. Even so, the Cleveland shale world that made Dunkleosteus famous was not an untouched paradise of placoderm confidence. It came after a major biotic shock. Carr's work on the Cleveland member fauna describes it as a unique view of the time after the Frasnian-Furmenian extinction, with the recovery of Arthrodires best represented by this exceptionally rich North American fauna. That point matters more than it might first appear. The Cleveland Sea was not simply before the end, it was also after a loss. Earlier in the late Devonian, the Kelwasser crises around the Frasnian-Furmenian boundary had already hit marine ecosystems hard, devastating reef systems and reshaping faunas on a global scale. One Frontiers synthesis summarizes the Frasnian-Furmenian transition as one of the big 5 mass extinctions and notes multiple clustered extinction pulses in the latest Frasnian to earliest Furmenian, with severe impacts in marine ecosystems, especially reefs and fishes. So when Dunkleosteus takes centre stage in the Cleveland member, it is doing so in a sea that had already been simplified, stressed, and reorganised once before. Its rise was, in part, a rise through the cracks left by a previous collapse. There is something almost ruthless about that timing. Extinction does not merely destroy, it clears. It removes old dominance, strips complexity from ecosystems, and leaves space for whatever can adapt to the new arrangement fastest or most effectively. The Cleveland member seems to record exactly that kind of world. Not a freshly invented ecosystem, but a rebuilt one. Carr's paleoecology paper places Dunkleosteus torelli in the late Furmenian, living pelagically within the water column of the Appalachian Basin, while the Cleveland fauna overall includes dozens of vertebrate taxa, particularly sharks and placoderms. This is not the picture of a final fading placoderm world barely limping toward extinction. It is a picture of recovery with real structure, real competition, and real ecological ambition. Dunkleosteus does not appear here as a relic. It appears as one of the winners of the Reconstruction phase. That makes its rise easier to see in ecological rather than purely genealogical terms. Whether or not one could trace a straight ancestral chain through every species of Dunkleosteus is less important here than the broader fact that large arthrodire predators remained not only present but formidable after the earlier late Devonian crisis. The Cleveland member fauna shows arthrodires recovering and diversifying, and Dunkleosteus torelli stands among the clearest signs that this recovery included apex predation at a very high level. The fish's armour, broad gape, cutting jaw plates, and open water body design were not evolutionary leftovers. They were working answers to a post-crisis sea still crowded with prey, rivals and hard defences. Rise in this sense did not mean simply getting bigger over time. It meant becoming the animal most capable of turning a stressed but productive offshore ecosystem into opportunity. And the ecosystem offered plenty to work with. Carr's study describes the Cleveland member as one of the best known and most species-rich late Devonian fish faunas, with 66 species including 33 sharks, 28 placoderms, and 5 osteichthyons. That kind of diversity is not the signature of an empty sea. It is the signature of a rebuilt one, with multiple predatory lineages, multiple prey types, and enough ecological layering for a true top predator to matter. Dunkleosteus rose not because nothing else was left, but because something very much was. There were other placoderms, there were sharks, there were bony fishes, there were shelled prey. There was traffic in the upper water column over the disaerobic or anoxic basin floor. In such a setting, a fish that could seize fast prey, bite through resistant prey, and operate as a pelagic hunter had every reason to prosper. Its rise was not abstract. It was mechanical, ecological, and immediate, written in each successful strike and each defended prey animal that turned out not to be defended enough. Still, the late Devonian was not a period that rewarded confidence for very long. Even while Dunkleosteus and other predators flourished in the Furmenian, the wider Earth system remained unstable. Modern work on the late Devonian extinction interval points again and again to interacting stresses rather than a single simple cause. The 2023 Communications Earth and Environment study on land plant expansion argues that the spread of deeply rooting plants across continental interiors likely increased phosphorus delivery to the oceans, stimulating productivity, organic matter burial, and widespread bottom water oxygen loss. The same paper notes a growing body of evidence linking large igneous province eruptions to the late Devonian crises, and emphasises that both volcanism and terrestrial nutrient export plausibly fed into marine anoxia. The Frontiers Mercury study likewise links anomalous mercury signals near the Frasnian-Furmenian boundary to temporally associated volcanism, and summarises the interval as one marked by climate oscillations, sea level changes, oxygen fluctuations, seawater anoxia and hypoxia, eutrophication, and broader instability in geochemical cycles. In other words, the ocean tyrant lived in a sea whose chemistry and climate were not quietly minding their own business. That's important because apex predators often seem permanent right up until the base of the system shifts under them. A hunter can dominate prey. It cannot dominate oxygen depletion. It can win contests with rivals. It cannot outbite a collapse in food web structure. It can range through the upper water column, with all the confidence of a creature wearing its own set of bone blades. But if the larger world begins to constrict the habitable layer, alter prey communities, or repeatedly destabilise marine ecosystems, even a successful predator finds itself living on narrower margins than its appearance suggests. The Cleveland member itself already points to a water column split between oxygenated surface layers and oxygen-poor deeper waters. That means Dunkleosteus lived in a sea with built-in vertical limits. A basin like that can remain productive for a time, but it is also a reminder that marine dominance is often more fragile than the dominating animal looks. And then came the final blow, not at the Frasnian-Furmenian transition where Dunkleosteus appears after recovery, but later, at the end of the Devonian. Carr's overview of the Cleveland fauna states this very plainly. The Cleveland Shale records a time after the Frasnian-Furmenian crisis, and this interval was followed by the Hangenberg biocrisis, leading to the extinction of arthrodires and all other placoderms. Sallin and Coates' well-known study on the end Devonian bottleneck similarly found acute and systematic effects centred on the Hangenberg extinction, with long-term losses exceeding 50% in major vertebrate clades. A later synthesis on non-marine mass extinctions also describes the Hangenberg event as a vertebrate bottleneck, and ties that interpretation in large part to the extinction of placoderms. So the vanishing of Dunkleosteus was not the private tragedy of one famous fish. It was part of a broader vertebrate turnover that cut down an entire successful design tradition. The armoured rulers of the Devonian seas did not slowly fade into irrelevance. They were hit by a boundary crisis large enough to remove the group altogether. There is something almost unfair about that. A creature can spend millions of years perfecting a role, becoming the thing other bodies in the water shape their behaviour around, and then discover that history is not actually impressed by specialisation. The Hangenberg event did not arrive to evaluate whether Dunkleosteus still bit well, or whether its armour remained convincing, or whether its place in the local food web had been earned. It arrived as a broad planetary filter. Some lineages passed through. Placoderms did not. That is one reason the end of Dunkleosteus feels so abrupt in retrospect. We do not watch it gently decline through a long visible tapering of incompetence. We see it in a rich late Devonian fauna, and then understand, with the help of later rocks, that the entire placoderm chapter closed soon after. The sea did not merely demote the tyrant, it ended the dynasty. The aftermath matters too, because extinction is never only about disappearance, it is also about what comes next. The 2026 Science Advances report summarised in search results notes that post-extinction ecosystems hosted the first definitive appearances of most major vertebrate lineages of the Paleozoic age of fishes and of today. The 2010 bottleneck study likewise frames the end Devonian extinction as a major reset in vertebrate history. That means the vanishing of Dunkleosteus and the placoderms was not merely the end of one famous predator. It was part of a reshuffling that helped clear ecological and evolutionary space for lineages that would later become much more familiar parts of vertebrate history. One can say this without being sentimental about it. Nature did not make room kindly. It removed an old order and another order expanded afterward. The future is often built that way, though it does feel rather cold when you happen to admire the old order's jaw design. Seen this way, the phrase ocean tyrant becomes both accurate and slightly misleading. It is accurate because Dunkleosteus really does appear to have been among the most formidable pelagic vertebrate predators of its environment. It is misleading because tyrant sounds stable, and no late Devonian ruler truly was. The seas of that age were dynamic to the point of volatility. Reefs collapsed and recovered unevenly. Oxygen levels shifted. Nutrient loads changed. Volcanism may have contributed pulses of wider environmental stress. Land plants were transforming continental weathering and runoff. Marine faunas were repeatedly pruned and rebuilt. Dunkleosteus rose in one rebuilt world and vanished in the approach to another collapse. Its reign, if one wants to call it that, was therefore real but temporary, powerful but contingent, glorious in the very old biological sense that it worked until it did not. That temporary quality is part of what makes the animal so compelling. Had Dunkleosteus survived into the Carboniferous and beyond, placoderms might now feel like one more long-lasting vertebrate group, strange but familiar in the grand march of life. Instead, they became a closed experiment. The armour, the arthrodire joint, the great bony jaw blades, the whole severe and beautiful machinery of their heads, all of it ended. Later vertebrate predators would become enormous, elegant, fast, clever, and terrifying in their own ways, but they would not be Dunkleosteus. They would not carry the same front-loaded fortress design or the same extinct answer to the problem of resistant prey. The vanishing of the animal matters not only because a top predator disappeared, but because an entire style of being a top predator disappeared with it. And yet, for all that finality in the rocks, the rise and vanishing of Dunkleosteus do not feel like a neat rise and fall morality play. They feel more like a geological reminder that success is always local. For a while, in those late Furmenian seas over the anoxic basin floor, this fish was extraordinarily well built for its world. The armour made sense, the jaws made sense, the body made sense, the prey base made sense. Then the world changed in ways large enough to make sense itself irrelevant. That is not failure, it is timing. A predator can be perfectly adapted to the wrong century. In the case of Dunkleosteus, the wrong century happened to last millions of years and still end badly. There is a rough honesty in that. It keeps the animal from becoming cartoonish. It was not immortal because no animal is. It was simply one of the best things its sea could build before the sea moved on. So the tyrant rose through a recovering fauna, flourished in a crowded and unstable ocean, and vanished in the end Devonian bottleneck that took the placoderms with it. That is the broad arc, and it is dramatic enough without any help. But there is still one more reason the fish persists so stubbornly in the imagination. Even after its body has been shortened, its jaw mechanics revised, and its entire world folded into extinction. It lingers because some animals stop being merely historical facts and become symbols of how we picture the deep past itself. Alien, forceful, half-known, and impossible to leave entirely in the shale. That is where the story naturally drifts next, because once the sea has swallowed the tyrant and the rocks have given us back only pieces, what remains is not only the fossil, but the hold it still has on us. Some prehistoric animals are famous because they were enormous, some are famous because they were strange, some are famous because they happened to arrive at exactly the right moment in modern culture, when books, museum halls, television documentaries, and children with an alarming appetite for monsters were all waiting for something memorable to latch onto. Dunkleosteus managed all three. It was large, though not as absurdly large as older reconstructions once claimed. It was strange in a very specific way, with that plated skull, those bone blades, and that deeply unhelpful expression of mechanical confidence. And it entered public life early enough, and vividly enough, that it never really left. Even now, more than 160 years after the first discoveries in Ohio, it remains one of the most recognizable prehistoric animals, with casts of its skull and mouth parts displayed in museums around the world. That is not a small achievement for a fish whose body still refuses to cooperate fully with the fossil record. Part of the reason is visual. Dunkleosteus does not need much explanation before it starts doing its work on the imagination. A person can know almost nothing about placoderms, arthrodires, or Devonian geology, and still take one look at that skull and think, quite reasonably, that this seems like a creature designed by someone who mistrusted moderation. The head is broad and plated, the mouth is not lined with familiar teeth but with sharpened bony edges. The whole front half looks like an argument against softness. Many fossil animals ask you to learn the details before they begin to feel interesting. Dunkleosteus does not. It introduces itself immediately, and only afterward do the details come in and make it even stranger. The more you learn, the less it turns into an ordinary fish, and the more it becomes a reminder that vertebrate history was full of successful designs that later vanished completely. That last part matters more than it may seem. Dunkleosteus is not merely a scary fossil. It is a scary fossil from a design path that ended. Sharks still exist. Crocodiles still exist. Large predatory bony fishes still exist. So when we see those animals, however impressive they may be, part of our mind files them under continuing story. Dunkleosteus is different. It belongs to a group of armoured-jawed fishes that flourished in the Devonian and then disappeared. The armour, the arthrodire joint, the great jaw blades, the whole severe arrangement of the skull, none of that survived as a living tradition. That gives Dunkleosteus a slightly different weight in the imagination. It does not feel like an ancestor you might squint and still recognise in a modern descendant. It feels like a closed experiment, preserved just well enough to be understood, and just incompletely enough to stay unsettling. There is also the matter of timing. The Cleveland Museum frames Dunkleosteus as the ruler of Ohio's ancient tropical sea, and that local angle has helped to keep it vivid. It is one thing to hear that an ancient monster lived in some abstract prehistoric ocean. It is another to hear that the place where people now park their cars, walk their dogs, or complain gently about the weather was once under warm marine water patrolled by an armoured fish with bone blades for jaws. A fossil becomes easier to remember when it has an address. Dunkleosteus has one. It is tied to Cleveland, to the Ohio Shale, to Lake Erie Cliffs, to museum collections built from river exposures and construction sites. That local rooting makes it feel less like mythology and more like the sort of truth the ground has been keeping to itself for a very long time. Museums have played their part in this too, and not only by displaying the fossils, they have helped turn Dunkleosteus into a public character. The Cleveland Museum's recent writing presents Dunk almost as a host for the ancient Ohio seas, a specimen people can meet, imagine, and use as a doorway into a whole vanished ecosystem. The museum's display connects casts of the real fossils to full-body silhouettes so visitors can picture the living animal, while the Case Western and Phys.org coverage emphasises that casts of its skull are on display in museums around the world. That combination is powerful. A fossil gains cultural afterlife when it can serve both as a precise scientific object and as a recognisable face for an entire lost world. Dunkleosteus has become exactly that kind of fossil. It is not only a specimen, it is a shorthand. Say the name, and people immediately picture a Devonian predator with a mouth like hardware, and yet the fame would not have lasted if the science had gone cold. One of the more remarkable facts about Dunkleosteus is that, despite all that public recognition, it also remained scientifically underexplored for a very long time. Case Western's 2025 summary notes that detailed work on the jaw anatomy had not been substantially revisited since 1932. That means generations of people were looking at one of paleontology's best-known predator faces, while many of the finer anatomical questions still sat there waiting. New research has now started correcting that, showing that nearly half the skull was cartilaginous, that the jaw musculature was more complex than older reconstructions appreciated, and that Dunkleosteus was in some ways an oddball, even among arthrodires. This does something interesting to its public image. It keeps the animal from turning into a static icon. Instead of becoming dull through overexposure, it becomes more compelling because the familiar monster is still being revised. That is one of the quiet pleasures of a fossil like this. It can withstand correction. In fact, correction often improves it. The 2024 reconstruction argued strongly for a shorter, deeper, stockier Dunkleosteus than the old giant shark-like versions, with typical adults around 3 to 3.5 metres, and the largest individuals around a bit over 4 metres, not the bus-sized exaggerations of older popular media. At first glance, that sounds like a reduction, but in practice it sharpened the animal. The long, vague tail of old reconstructions gave way to something more compact and more coherent, a predator whose body now makes better functional sense with the preserved armour. The fish became less stretched and more believable. Oddly enough, that made it easier to imagine, not harder. A good fossil icon survives being made more accurate. Dunkleosteus did exactly that. There is a lesson in that which reaches beyond this one fish. People sometimes assume that scientific revision drains wonder from the past, as though every new paper exists mainly to take a beloved monster and reduce it to something less exciting. What actually happens, more often, is that the wonder shifts from vague spectacle to sharp reality. The old Dunkleosteus was impressive because it was supposedly huge. The newer Dunkleosteus is impressive because it was precise. It had a deep armoured trunk, a mechanically unusual skull, self-sharpening bone blades, and a body increasingly understood as built for active open water predation rather than for vague monstrousness. Science did not take away the danger. It took away the unnecessary blur around it. What remained was not smaller in any emotional sense. It was simply harder to dismiss as a cartoon. That may be why Dunkleosteus still works so well as an idea even for people who do not follow paleontology closely. It satisfies two very old human appetites at once. One is the appetite for predators. We are endlessly interested in animals that sit high in a food web, especially when they seem overbuilt, direct, and mechanically certain. The other is the appetite for lost worlds. Dunkleosteus comes attached to an entire vanished setting. Devonian seas, armoured fishes, early sharks, reef systems, anoxic basins, and extinction events that closed a whole chapter of vertebrate history. So when people say they are fascinated by Dunkleosteus, they are often responding not only to the fish itself, but to the enormous room of time that opens around it. It is a front door into a world where almost everything feels familiar enough to follow and strange enough to remain unsettling. The American Museum of Natural History's material on the Devonian extinctions gets at part of this feeling, describing Dunkleosteus as one of the first big ocean-going predatory animals, occupying a role loosely comparable to what we might now imagine for a great white shark. That comparison is useful so long as it is handled gently. Dunkleosteus was not a shark. It was not even very much like one in several important anatomical ways, but the comparison tells modern minds where to place the emotional weight. It says, here was a predator that sat in open water with real authority. Here was a vertebrate hunter large enough, specialised enough, and successful enough to change the behaviour of the animals around it. That role is easy for us to grasp because modern seas still contain echoes of it. The form is extinct. The ecological tension is not. There is another reason the fish lingers. It never becomes entirely transparent. We know much more about it now than we did a generation ago, but we do not know everything, and that remaining uncertainty matters. The body is still incompletely known. The exact feeding mechanics have been revised and may be refined further. The larger significance of some anatomical features is still being worked out. Case Western's summary says very plainly that even the poster child of Arthrodires turned out to be unusual among its own relatives. That means Dunkleosteus is not a closed file. It is a familiar fossil with unfinished business, and unfinished things stay in the mind. A solved puzzle is satisfying, but a half-solved one tends to follow you home a little more stubbornly. Perhaps that is why it works so well at night, as a subject for a long quiet narration when the mind is tired enough to be curious without becoming argumentative. Dunkleosteus gives you something concrete to hold on to. Armour, blades, fossils in shale, museum casts. Researchers revisiting old anatomy with new methods. But it also leaves room for the softer kind of thinking that comes in the late hours. What must it have been like to see one in life, not as a mount or an illustration, but as a moving body turning in warm Devonian water? What did smaller fish register first? The size, the shape, the sudden opening of the mouth, or just the wrongness of that plated head arriving from the dim? What did it feel like for generations of museum visitors to stop in front of the skull and realise with a little internal shiver that the sea once contained this? Those are not questions science can answer fully, but they are part of why the fossil remains alive in culture. It gives the imagination enough material to work with and enough missing pieces to keep working. It also helps that Dunkleosteus is strangely honest. Some extinct predators become grand in a way that can feel almost elegant. Their skeletons are beautiful. Their movement seems refined. Their menace arrives with a kind of grace. Dunkleosteus is not especially graceful in that sense. It is compelling because it is bluntly purposeful. The head looks built for force. The armour looks built for impact and protection. The mouth looks built for a task it performed without apology. There is no delicate deception in the design. Even after the newer research revealed more cartilage and more nuance in the skull, the overall impression did not become gentler. It became more biologically real, but still severe. That severity translates easily across generations and media. A child sees a monster. A paleontologist sees an unusual arthrodire with a history of misreconstruction and a fascinating jaw. Both are, in their own way, seeing the same thing. And then there is the simplest reason of all. Dunkleosteus is fun to remember. Not because it was silly, and not because it needs to be exaggerated to stay interesting, but because it sits in that sweet spot where science and imagination hold each other up instead of pulling apart. The facts are strong enough to matter. The image is strong enough to last. The revisions are strong enough to keep it fresh. Even its name helps. All bone and weight and hard consonants. Some fossils remain inside journals. Some escape into public life. Dunkleosteus escaped long ago and has shown no interest in going back. The fish is too useful. Teachers use it to talk about the Devonian. Museums use it to anchor local geology in deep time. Writers use it because it instantly creates atmosphere. Readers and viewers remember it because one glance is usually enough to make a permanent arrangement with the memory. So perhaps haunting is the right word after all, though not in the dramatic sense of shadows and curses and ominous music swelling somewhere behind a fossil case. It haunts the imagination more quietly than that. It lingers, it stays. It returns when you think about the early history of Jaws, about the age of fishes, about museum monsters that turned out to be real animals and real scientific problems at the same time. It returns when you think about how entire successful body plans can vanish, leaving only armour in shale and a silhouette in a gallery hall. It returns when you remember that some of the most recognisable creatures in prehistory are still being rewritten, not because they were false, but because the truth is richer and stranger than the first version anyone drew. Dunkleosteus persists because it is both a fossil and a correction to our instinct that the past must have been simpler than the present. It was not simpler, it was just earlier. And so we end not in the Devonian Sea itself, though the water is still there if you want to picture it one more time, warm above, darker below, full of moving bodies and old appetites. We end here, in the present, with a fossil fish that still manages to do what the best ancient animals do. It turns stone into motion. It turns geology into story. It reminds us that the deep past was not a rehearsal for our world, but a world in its own right, complete with tyrants, failed dynasties, engineering solutions now lost, and faces so strange that even after a century and a half of study, they still feel newly unreasonable. If you have drifted gently through these old waters tonight, if Dunkleosteus has kept you company in that quiet way only a very ancient predator can, I hope the journey has been worth the millions of years. And wherever you are listening from, in whatever small hour has found you, it is pleasant to think that one of the oldest terrors ever carried by a vertebrate sea still survives not in water now, but in museums, in papers, in memory, and in that part of the mind that never quite stops making room for monsters.